Hey there, night owl. Wherever you are, curled up right now under a blanket, propped against a pillow, maybe already fighting to keep your eyes open. Thank you for choosing to spend this quiet hour with me tonight. Here is something that might keep you up a little longer right before it gently helps put you to sleep. For most of human history, waking up in the middle of the night was not a problem. It was not insomnia, and it was not a broken internal clock. It was simply normal. For thousands of years, almost every person across Europe went to bed once each night and woke up twice. Nobody thought that was strange at all. Stay with me tonight because we are going to find out why. But first, a small favour, and only if you actually mean it. If you enjoy this kind of slow deep dive storytelling, a like or a subscribe helps this little project keep going, though. Only tap that button if tonight's story earns it no guilt trips here. And I am always curious about the people on the other side of this screen. Where are you watching from tonight, and what time is it where you are right now? Leave it in the comments. I look through every single one, even the ones that just say, "Still awake, send help." Now, if you can dim the lights a little more, maybe switch on a fan or something with a soft, steady hum, just enough background sound to make the story feel closer. Get comfortable, because tonight we're stepping into a version of the night that most of us have completely forgotten how to live in. Picture a small stone house somewhere in the English countryside long before electricity ever existed. Outside, the night is enormous and completely black, the kind of darkness most of us will never really know without a single street lamp for miles in any direction. Inside, the fire has burned down to a few soft orange embers, just enough light to outline the edge of a table, a chair, a row of worn shoes by the door. The shutters are pulled tight against the cold night air. A family lies together under heavy wool blankets, breathing slow and even, fast asleep for now. In the late 1600s, in a small English courtroom, a 9-year-old girl named Jane Roth sat and answered questions about the night her mother disappeared. What Jane said was simple, almost thrown away, the kind of detail nobody in the room thought twice about at the time. She said her mother had gotten up after her first sleep to step outside for a moment. Her mother never came back inside. She was found later out in the cold and had not survived the night. That one small phrase, first sleep, sat undisturbed inside a legal record for centuries unnoticed, until a historian named Roger E. Kirch, a professor at Virginia Polytechnic Institute, happened across it while researching something else entirely. Like most of us, he had always assumed that 8 unbroken hours of sleep was simply how the human body was built to rest. But that little phrase would not leave him alone, because in the deposition nobody bothered to explain what a first sleep actually was. Nobody defined it. It was mentioned the way you might mention having breakfast or feeding the cat, something so ordinary it needed no introduction at all. So the professor went looking for more, and what he found tucked inside old diaries, court records, medical texts, and even prayer books was not one strange mention. It was hundreds of them. Over 500 references scattered across centuries and countries, all describing the exact same thing. A night split cleanly in half. Here is how that night usually worked long before clocks ruled our lives the way they do now. Families went to bed early, not long after sunset, often somewhere around 9 or 10 in the evening. There was little reason to stay up later. Candles cost money, firewood cost money, and the dark outside your window was frankly not somewhere you wanted to be without a very good reason. Not every wakeful hour looked the same, by the way. In a poor farmer's cottage, that hour might mean checking a leaking roof or feeding a hungry infant by weak candlelight. In a wealthy household, it might mean guests still lingering from an earlier supper, playing cards by the fire, or a lady of the house writing letters that nobody else would see until morning. Money changed the scenery. It never changed the rhythm. They would drop into what was called their first sleep, a deep, heavy rest. that usually lasted around 3 to 3.5 hours, and then they woke up. On purpose, more or less. Not from a nightmare, not from a noise outside, just naturally, as if the body had finished one chapter of the night and needed a short pause before beginning the next one. That waking hour, sometimes stretching to nearly 2 hours, was never treated like a problem that needed solving. It was simply a normal part of the night, and people filled it in the most quietly human ways imaginable. Some stayed right where they were and talked softly with a husband or wife, the kind of honest, unguarded conversation that only ever seems to happen in the dark. Physicians of the period even wrote that this particular hour right after the first sleep was believed to be the best time for a married couple to grow closer, since, as one old medical text rather gently put it, people simply enjoyed themselves more once that first sleep had passed. A funny thing to find written down in a serious medical book, but there it is in black and white. Mothers use this hour too, nursing a baby by candlelight, rocking a fussy child back towards sleep, the kind of exhausted tenderness that has not changed one bit in 600 years. Others got up entirely. They checked the fire so it would not go cold before morning. In farming villages, some walked out to look in on the animals. In small towns, a few even slipped out to visit a neighbour, because apparently gossip does not wait politely for daylight, not even in the 16th century. And a great many people simply lay there in the dark, praying softly, or turning over a dream they had just had, the exact way we now turn over a stressful email at 11 at night, staring at the ceiling instead of drifting back off. If you happen to be watching this right now, wide awake, wondering why on earth you're up again at 3 in the morning, I want you to know something comforting. A person living 600 years ago would have looked at you and simply said, "Congratulations, you are right on schedule." And this was not some small medieval oddity, far from it. Professor Akirch traced this pattern all the way back to Homer's Odyssey, written almost 3,000 years ago, and to Virgil's Aeneid a few centuries after that. The ancient Romans even had their own name for it, calling that first stretch of sleep primus somnus. Julius Caesar used a version of the phrase himself, describing the quiet hours right after nightfall, when a military camp had only just settled down for the night. Geoffrey Chaucer wrote about it too inside the Canterbury Tales. So did countless ordinary villagers, whose names never made it into any history book at all. Only their habits did, carried forward inside the words they happened to leave behind. So what happened to it? Why don't we sleep this way anymore? The short answer is light. Cheap, reliable, artificial light. In January of 1807, a street called Pall Mall in London became one of the first in the world, lit by gas lamps glowing steadily through the dark in a way candlelight never quite managed. Within a couple of decades, gaslighting had spread through major cities across Europe and America. Night stopped feeling so dark and so endless. People began staying up later, working longer hours and going to bed later too. Slowly, without anyone deciding it on purpose, the two separate sleeps began pressing together into one. That quiet waking hour in the middle shrank down to almost nothing, then faded away completely for most of us. By the time our great-great-grandparents were young, the two sleeps were already treated as something old-fashioned, something rural, something you would only stumble upon far from any city lights. And once psychiatry became a serious modern science in the 20th century, doctors started treating that middle-of-the-night wakefulness as a disorder in need of fixing rather than a rhythm the human body had followed for thousands of years. Here is the part that still gives me chills if I am honest with you. This did not stay buried in dusty archives forever. In the early 1990s, a sleep researcher named Thomas Ware, working at the National Institute of Mental Health, placed a group of healthy volunteers into 14 hours of total darkness every night for an entire month. No clocks, no screens, nothing but real deep darkness, the kind almost nobody experiences anymore. For the first few nights, the volunteers simply slept and slept and slept, as if paying off some ancient debt. But by the 4th week, without anyone telling them, their bodies settled into something oddly familiar. Around 4 hours of sleep, then 1 to 3 hours of calm, quiet wakefulness, then another 4 hours of sleep. The exact rhythm of the 16th century rediscovered completely by accident in a modern laboratory, simply by turning the lights off. And in case you're thinking this pattern only survives in old court records and science experiments, it does not. Even today, certain communities, including the Tiv people of central Nigeria, still sleep this way, as a matter of course, and still use the very same words for it. First sleep, second sleep. Nobody handed them a history book. Their bodies simply never stop doing what human bodies have always done once you take the electric lights away. There is something quietly moving about all of that if you sit with it for a moment. Right now, tonight, millions of people lie awake at 2 in the morning and immediately assume something is wrong with them. They reach for their phone, they check the time with a small flicker of panic. They wonder if their body has somehow failed them. But for most of human history, that exact same moment wide awake in the dark was never something to fear. It was simply where the night paused to breathe, an hour that belonged to nobody but you, time to think, to talk, to pray, to simply exist in the dark without needing to explain yourself to anyone, not even yourself. Here is the part almost everyone gets wrong the first time they hear about this, by the way. It is tempting to assume that people who slept in 2 pieces were sleeping badly, or sleeping less than we do now. They were not. Added together, that first sleep and second sleep usually equal just as much rest as we get in one modern night, sometimes more. The difference was never the amount of sleep. It was only ever the shape of it. Researchers studying VAERS volunteers even noticed something almost poetic. The first sleep tended to carry more of the deep restorative stage, the kind that repairs the body. The second lighter sleep carried more of the dreaming stage, which may explain why so many old diaries describe waking from a vivid dream right in the middle of the night and lying there quietly turning it over before drifting off to sleep again. That is the strange gift hidden inside a frightened 9-year-old girl's small sad story told in a courtroom more than 3 centuries ago. One offhand sentence about a first sleep turned out to hold the key to something about ourselves that we had simply forgotten how to remember. But before any family could drift off into that first sleep at all, something else had to happen first, almost every single night in nearly every town across Europe. A sound had to move through the streets, slow and heavy and impossible to ignore. A bell had to ring, and when it finally did, an entire town from the poorest farmer to the wealthiest merchant had exactly one job left to finish before anyone was allowed to shut their eyes. That sound did not start in one place. It rolled outward from the church tower, low and unhurried, the kind of sound that never had to ask for attention, only expect it. And the moment people heard it, whatever they were doing, they stopped. Picture a mother kneeling by the hearth, one hand still resting on the iron poker. A merchant halfway through, locking his shop for the night. A group of boys chasing each other through a muddy lane, breath fogging in the cold air. All of them in that same instant doing the exact same small thing, listening, because that bell was not decoration. It was an order, and everyone in town understood exactly what it meant, even the children too young to explain it in words. Cover the fire, go inside. The night has officially begun. Watch what happens next. House by house, almost like a wave rolling down the street. A father kneels beside his own hearth and rakes the glowing coals into a tight, careful pile. A mother checks the corners of the room one last time, feeling along the floor with her bare foot for any stray ember that might have rolled free. Shutters swing shut. A dog is called in from the yard. One window goes dark, then the window beside it, then the one after that, until an entire street that had been glowing gold just minutes earlier sinks quietly into black. Nobody had to knock on doors and remind anyone. The bell did the work for the whole town all at once. We call it a curfew today, and most of us picture something fairly modern, something political soldiers in the street, a government telling people to stay home. But the word itself is far older than that, and its original meaning had almost nothing to do with control. It came from Old French, from the phrase couvre-feu, which simply means cover fire. Not lock your doors, not hide indoors, cover your fire. Ask yourself something for a moment if you do not mind. When was the last time your entire home ran on one single open flame? No electricity, no gas stove, nothing at all, but a wood fire burning inside a house built largely out of timber and dry thatch, packed tightly beside dozens of other houses just like it. Now imagine one careless spark at midnight while everyone on the entire street is fast asleep. That was not a rare disaster. That was simply an ordinary Tuesday in almost any medieval town. Fire was the single greatest danger these towns faced, far steadier a threat than war, far more frequent than plague. A city built of wood lit only by candles and open hearths could lose half its houses in a single night if nobody thought to smother the coals before bed. So towns across Europe settled on the same simple solution. Every evening, usually somewhere around 8 o'clock, a bell rang out from the church tower or the town hall, and it meant exactly one thing for every household within earshot. Put the fire out or cover it completely before anyone dared shut their eyes. Some homes even owned a specific tool built just for this moment, a metal or ceramic dome, oddly enough also called a couvre-feu, that fit directly over the glowing coals, starving the flame of air, while keeping just enough warmth alive to relight the fire quickly the next morning. It was in its own quiet way one of the earliest fire safety devices in Western history, centuries before anyone had dreamed up a smoke detector. Owning one of these domes, though, said something about your household. Wealthier families kept polished bronze or fine glazed clay versions, sometimes decorated, almost treated as a small piece of furniture in their own right. Poorer households simply used whatever they had on hand, an old iron pot lid, a broken piece of slate, or nothing more than a bare hand and a stick raking cold ash directly over the coals until the glow disappeared. The fire still got covered either way. Only the tool changed depending on what a family could afford. The idea itself was not confined to one language or one country either. In the formal Latin used by lawmakers of the period, the exact same rule sometimes appeared under a different name, entirely written down as ignitigium, or occasionally pyritigium, both meaning roughly the same thing, a covering of fire. Travel south into Italy centuries later, and you will still hear an echo of it in the word coprifuoco. Different accents, different centuries, the exact same idea, quietly repeated across an entire continent, because a wooden town at night has always been a wooden town at night, no matter which language its people happen to speak. You will often hear one particular story attached to all of this, and I want to be honest with you about it because honesty matters more to me than a tidy legend. Many popular retellings credit William the Conqueror with inventing the curfew bell in England right after he took the throne, supposedly as a clever way to stop Saxon rebels from gathering secretly under cover of darkness. It is a wonderful story, and there is likely a grain of truth tucked inside it, since strict curfews were absolutely enforced under his rule, with real fines and real punishment waiting for anyone caught with an open flame after the bell. But historians who have gone back through the earliest surviving records tell a slightly less dramatic version. The habit of ringing an evening bell to cover fires was already common across continental Europe, long before William ever crossed the Channel. He did not invent the idea. He simply enforced it with unusual severity, for reasons that were as much about political control as they ever were about fire safety. And personally, I find that version more interesting, not less, because it means this one bell was quietly doing two completely different jobs at the exact same time, and nobody standing in the street could necessarily tell which job it was doing on any given night. Was the bell protecting their homes, or was it keeping watch over their movements? From the outside in the dark, those two things could look exactly the same. Here is a detail I love tucked away inside old regulations from medieval Venice. When the curfew bell rang, almost the entire city had to comply within minutes, extinguishing every open flame in sight. Almost the entire city except one small neighbourhood, the barber's quarter. Because during that period, a barber was not simply someone who cut hair. Barbers also performed minor surgery, pulled aching teeth, set broken bones, treated fresh wounds, whatever medical need happened to appear at the door. Venice decided that a barber's lamp needed to stay lit after dark just in case somebody bled through the night and needed help before sunrise. One entire profession quietly excused from a citywide fire law because somebody somewhere might need stitches at 2 a.m. I think about that small exemption more than I probably should. It tells you something honest about how medieval towns actually thought underneath all their rigid rules. Safety mattered enormously to them, but so did mercy whenever the two happened to collide. Of course, precautions failed sometimes, and when they did, a medieval town had to fight fire with tools that look almost primitive to us now, and work surprisingly well anyway. Neighbours formed a human chain from the nearest well or river straight to the burning building, passing leather buckets hand to hand as fast as they could move. If the flames climbed too high to control, men carried long wooden poles fitted with iron hooks and used them to physically rip burning thatch and timber down off a roof, sacrificing one house on purpose to keep the fire from leaping to the next. And if the danger was serious enough, that same church bell that had rung so calmly at curfew would ring again, but differently, faster, harder, an unmistakable pattern that told everyone within hearing distance that this particular night was not going to be a quiet one after all. It is worth pausing on something here because I think it gets misunderstood constantly. When modern people hear the word curfew, they usually picture confinement, a government forcing citizens to stay indoors, often against their will, sometimes backed by armed soldiers. The medieval version could occasionally carry that same political weight, especially under a ruler like William the Conqueror. But at its actual origin, curfew was closer to a shared household chore than a punishment. It was less about being controlled and more about everyone quietly agreeing to protect the same wooden street they all happened to live on together. Once the bell finished ringing and the fires had been dealt with, the town did not simply grow quiet. It went dark completely and totally dark in a way that is almost impossible for most of us to picture now. Have you ever stood somewhere with absolutely no light pollution at all? No orange glow sitting on the horizon? No porch lights left glowing anywhere nearby? If you have even just once, you already understand what an entire medieval town looked like every single night, right after that bell finished ringing. Not dim, not shadowy, simply gone. And into that darkness walked the night watch, a small rotating group of men, often ordinary citizens taking their turn at civic duty, rather than trained soldiers carrying lanterns and long wooden poles, pacing the same streets over and over again until dawn. Their job was part fire inspection, part law enforcement, and part something a little stranger, something closer to keeping the whole town company through the dark. If they noticed firelight glowing behind a shuttered window after curfew, the household inside could expect a fine or, in stricter periods, something considerably worse. If they heard anything unusual footsteps where there should not have been any, they went to investigate. In a world without streetlights, these men were in a very real sense the only thing standing between an ordinary town and total blackness. Quick question for you, And you do not even need to say it out loud. How many smoke detectors do you have in your own home right now? This very moment. Most of us could not answer immediately because we simply trust them to sit quietly on the ceiling and do their job without needing a second thought. A medieval household had no such luxury. Fire safety was not a small plastic disc mounted overhead. It was a nightly ritual performed by hand, checked by a neighbour's eyes, enforced by a stranger with a lantern walking past your window at midnight. There is one more layer to all of this, and it happens to be my favourite part because it has nothing to do with fire or law at all. It is pure folklore. Many people across medieval England truly believed that curfew marked the exact hour when restless spirits were set loose free to wander the earth until the first rooster crowed at dawn. William Shakespeare, writing generations later, still leaned on that old superstition. In one of his plays, a character describes a mischievous spirit that in his own words begins at curfew and walks until first cock. It is a small line, easy to miss entirely, but it tells you that even long after the original fire law had faded from memory, the bell itself had never quite lost its eerie reputation. People still felt that shift in the air the moment the sound stopped ringing, as if the ordinary rules of the world had quietly changed shape for a few hours. Is it not strange when you really sit with it, how a rule built entirely around practical fire safety slowly grew a second life as something almost supernatural? Nobody planned that. It simply happened the way folklore always seems to grow up around anything repeated often enough for long enough in the dark. Eventually, the strict version of the law softened. Not long after William the Conqueror's reign ended his successor, a king remembered today as Henry I relaxed the harsh restrictions considerably, and the absolute ban on nighttime light slowly loosened across England. But here is the part that still catches me off guard every time I think about it. The bell itself never really stopped ringing. In several English towns that same evening, bell kept sounding for centuries after it carried any legal weight at all, simply because the habit had quietly become part of the town's own identity. In a town called Morpeth in the north of England, a bell still rings out every single evening at 8 o'clock from the very same clock tower to this day. In a town called Chertsey, that same tradition continues too. Nobody there needs to cover a fire anymore. Most homes do not even own an open hearth, and still faithfully the bell rings. I find something quietly beautiful hidden inside that fact. An entire way of life built around candlelight and wood smoke has completely disappeared, replaced by electric lighting, central heating, smoke alarms wired straight into the ceiling. And yet somewhere in England right now tonight, while you listen to this, that same bell is still counting its way toward 8 o'clock, ringing out over streets that no longer need its warning at all, simply because a town decided one generation after another that the sound itself was worth keeping alive. Maybe that is the real story hiding inside a bell most people assume was only ever about locking doors and staying indoors. It was never really about confinement, not at its heart. It was a whole town agreeing every single night to look after one another one covered fire at a time, long before anybody thought to use a word like community to describe what they were actually doing. Once that fire was finally covered and the house had gone completely and properly dark, there was still one more decision waiting for almost every family before they could actually lie down and rest. Not when to sleep, not even where to sleep. Something far stranger than either of those, something that would have felt like plain common sense to them, and would look almost unbelievable to us now. How exactly a person was supposed to position their own body once the candle finally went out. If you have ever pictured a medieval bedroom in your head, there is a decent chance you pictured it slightly wrong, and honestly so did I for a long time. Here is the image most of us carry around without ever questioning it. Somewhere in an old stone castle, a person climbs into a strangely short bed, props themselves almost bolt upright against a mountain of pillows, and sleeps sitting up all night long because apparently lying flat was considered dangerous or improper or a little too near death for comfort. Tour guides love this story. I have heard it myself standing in a drafty castle hallway, nodding along like everyone else in the group. There is just one problem with it. Most of it is not quite true. When historians and museum curators actually went back and measured the surviving beds, the ones sitting in castles and old manor houses, right now something interesting happened. The beds were not short at all. Curators working through the furniture collections at places like Colonial Williamsburg found beds that matched and sometimes exceeded the size of a normal double bed today. That famous claim, the one about tiny beds forcing everyone to sleep sitting up, mostly falls apart the moment somebody brings out a tape measure. So where did the story come from? I think it is one of those tales that simply sounds too good not to repeat. Especially standing inside a properly creepy old castle at dusk, with a tour guide who knows exactly which detail makes a group lean in a little closer. It is not that the guides are lying to you, most of them are just repeating something they were told once that got repeated to them by somebody else, and so on backward through a very long game of historical telephone. Have you ever caught yourself doing the exact same thing, repeating a piece of trivia you heard once, certain it was true, only to find out later you had simply passed along somebody else's mistake? If so, you already understand the entire life story of the short medieval bed myth. But here is the part I actually love about this topic, the part that rarely makes it into the short version people tell each other. The myth is wrong, but it is wrong in the most interesting possible way, because it accidentally points towards something that really was happening, just not everywhere, and not for the reason most people assume. In parts of Northern Europe, particularly across Brittany and the Netherlands, ordinary families really did sleep in a strikingly upright position, night after night for centuries. Not because of superstition about death, because of furniture. These were called box beds, built directly into the wall like an oversized wooden cupboard, shut off from the rest of the room by sliding wooden panels or heavy curtains. Climb inside and you would find yourself propped upright by 3 or 4 stacked pillows sitting in a space barely long enough to stretch your legs out fully. An entire family might sleep together in one of these wooden boxes sealed away from the cold from the dirt floor below, and in some regions quite literally sealed away from the farm animals that shared the house with them overnight. Picture that for a second. Outside the box, a pig might be settling down beside the fire. Inside the box, an entire family tucked upright into their own private wooden room panels slid shut, safe and warm until morning. In parts of Brittany, families even believed these enclosed beds offered a kind of protection against wolves, one more layer of wood standing between a sleeping child and whatever might be moving through the dark outside. That is not superstition dressed up as furniture. That is architecture solving a very practical problem: cold nights, limited space, and a house that occasionally doubled as a barn. The habit outlived the medieval period by a long stretch too. Records describe workers in early industrial towns stacking these same box beds 2 or 3 high, inside cramped housing an entire family's worth of history, folded into a piece of furniture nobody today would recognize as a bed at all. Travel south instead of north and the whole picture changes completely. In the warmer stretches of the Mediterranean, where a chilly night was far less likely to threaten you, bedrooms tended to stay open, airy, unenclosed, built to let a breeze move freely through the room rather than sealing a family inside a wooden box until morning. Climate shaped how people slept just as powerfully as any physician's advice or ghost story ever did. A family in Brittany was quietly solving a completely different nightly problem than a family in southern Italy, even though both of them were simply trying to get a decent night's rest. Now that said, I do not want to swing too far the other way, and pretend nobody had any deeper reasons for sleeping propped up. Because plenty of people did, just not because of short furniture. Medieval and early modern medicine ran almost entirely on a framework built around 4 bodily substances called humours, and keeping them in careful balance was considered the whole secret to good health. Lying perfectly flat on your back, according to several physicians of the period, risk letting these fluids pool somewhere they should not, thickening in the chest, settling in the head, disturbing digestion after a heavy meal. Propping the upper body up on pillows was seen quite seriously as a form of preventative medicine, something recommended especially for the elderly, the unwell, or anyone who had eaten a large supper too near bedtime. Even the recommended length of a night's sleep was calculated this way, tied to a person's particular humoral balance, rather than to habit with one late 15th century instructional manual, settling on roughly 7 hours as sufficient a touch longer in the depths of winter, when the nights themselves stretched on regardless of what anybody's body actually needed. Physicians of the period also tended to steer people away from sleeping flat on their back, for a slightly different reason, a heavy-laboured kind of breathing they associated with a condition they simply called the nightmare await, pressing down on the chest during sleep. Side sleeping, propped just slightly, was generally considered the gentler choice for reasons that once again, modern sleep medicine does not entirely disagree with, even if it explains the mechanism rather differently today. By the time you reach the late 1500s, this belief had produced an entire category of specialized furniture among wealthier households, something historians now call the sleeping chair. Picture a heavily built armchair, wide padded, fitted with straps, and a hinged mechanism that let the back tilt down and a footrest rise up in careful coordination, so a person who felt too weak or too unwell to lie flat could still rest in real comfort upright enough to breathe easily, supported enough to actually sleep. Some versions even sat on small wheeled casters so a servant could roll a struggling patient closer to a window for fresh air or nearer the fire on a cold evening without ever asking them to stand. For its time, this was remarkably advanced engineering built entirely around a single stubborn question. How do you let a suffering body rest without forcing it to lie flat? These were not cheap. They belonged almost exclusively to aristocratic households, or later to physicians treating patients through long illnesses, the kind of slow-wasting sickness that might keep a person confined for months. But the underlying idea, elevate the body, ease the breathing, protect the digestion, is unmistakably the same idea tucked inside a simple stack of pillows in a poorer household down the road. One family solved the problem with imported mechanical engineering, the other solved it with whatever spare linen they had folded in a chest. Same instinct, completely different budget. Isn't it strange how certain instincts survive an entire collapse of medical science? Because if you have ever propped yourself up on an extra pillow after a big dinner, just to settle your stomach before sleep, you were unknowingly agreeing with a physician from roughly 600 years ago, even though neither of you would have understood the actual science behind it. And before you picture every single medieval person bolt upright at a stiff 90-degree angle, let me gently correct the record one more time. Surviving illustrations from the period, the ones showing people asleep, rather than simply resting in bed while awake, mostly show something far less dramatic. A person lying mostly flat head raised on a generously sized pillow or bolster, tilted at a shallow, comfortable angle. It was a range, not a rule, adjusted by season, by health, by how many pillows a household happened to own that particular year. History rarely hands us one single tidy answer, and this topic is a perfect example of why that is usually a good thing to remember. There was a second reason to quiet a stranger and considerably less medical. In parts of medieval England, some believed that sleeping completely flat mouth open left a person dangerously exposed while they slept, almost like leaving a door unlatched overnight. The fear was not simply about catching a chill. It was about something slipping in, or something slipping out while the body lay defenseless in the dark. Propping the head and shoulders up, keeping the mouth shut, chin slightly tucked, was one small, deliberate way of staying just a little more guarded until morning. And then there is the belief I find the most human of all, even though I cannot promise you it was universal. Some accounts describe a quiet discomfort around lying, completely flat on your back arms at your sides, still and motionless. Because that position, exactly that position, was the one used to lay a body out after death. Hands folded, eyes shut perfectly straight, often inside the family's own front room, for friends and neighbours to visit and pay their respects before burial. Candles burned at the head, and the feet during those visits the same soft light that only hours earlier might have lit an ordinary supper table. Whether or not every single medieval household consciously avoided that posture, out of fear, it is not hard to understand the instinct. Would you want to fall asleep every night in the exact shape your own body would eventually take, permanently surrounded by mourners in your own front room? I do not think that fear needs a footnote to feel believable. I think most of us, if we are honest, have felt some quiet version of it ourselves, lying very still in the dark, arms crossed over our chest, just for warmth, and catching ourselves thinking just for a second that we look like something out of a funeral before shifting position without really deciding to. There was also quite bluntly a matter of who was even allowed to enjoy a soft pillow in the first place. In several medieval households, pillows carried a whiff of weakness, considered appropriate for the very old, for young girls, for pregnant women, for the sick. A grown man, especially a soldier or a labourer, was often expected to sleep rougher, flatter, without much cushioning at all, as though comfort itself might soften him in ways that mattered beyond the bedroom. Soldiers on campaign sleeping wrapped in a cloak on open ground were not choosing that discomfort. They were living inside a set of expectations about what a capable body was supposed to be able to endure. It is a small detail, but I think it says something honest about how deeply gender and class could reach, even into something as private as how a person rested their own head at night. Here is a question worth sitting with for a moment if you are the kind of person still awake enough to think about it. How much of your own bedtime routine, the extra pillow, the side you automatically roll onto, the way you prop yourself up slightly after a heavy dinner, is really a personal preference, and how much of it is a habit you inherited without ever once tracing where it came from? Because here is the twist that truly surprised me when I first came across it doing the reading for tonight's story. Modern medicine, working with actual anatomy instead of humoral theory, still recommends elevating the upper body for people who struggle with heartburn or acid reflux after eating. Raise the torso, keep gravity working in your favour, and the stomach behaves itself far better overnight. Walk into almost any mattress store today, and you will find an entire shelf of wedge pillows built for exactly that purpose, sold to people who have never once heard the word humour used to describe blood, phlegm and bile. In other words, a physician working entirely from guesswork 6 centuries ago, without so much as a diagram of the human stomach, landed remarkably near something we now confirm through actual clinical research. Not for the reasons he believed, but near enough that I find it a little humbling. Maybe that is the real lesson tucked inside all of this, buried underneath the castle tour anecdotes and the slightly exaggerated stories about tiny beds. People have always been trying to solve the exact same nightly puzzle we are still solving right now: how to lie down safely, comfortably, without the body betraying us in the dark. Sometimes they solved it with folklore, sometimes with furniture built to fit a farmhouse instead of a body, and every so often, purely by accident, they solved it correctly centuries before anyone had the tools to prove why. None of this, by the way, tells you how a family afforded any of this in the first place. The bed itself, the pillows, the carved wooden panels shutting off a box bed from the rest of the house. Because in most homes of this period, a bed was not simply furniture you happened to own. It might be the single most valuable object anyone in the family possessed, valuable enough to be fought over, written into wills and remembered by name for generations after the person who first bought it had been laid out flat one final time in the exact position they'd spent a lifetime quietly trying to avoid. A room full of people all waiting to hear their own names spoken aloud by a stranger holding a single sheet of paper. That, in a sense, is exactly what a will reading used to be, centuries before television ever figured out how to make it dramatic. And in one particular room in the spring of 1616, one sentence buried near the end of that paper would end up outliving almost everything else the dying man had ever written, plays included. We will get to that sentence in a moment. But first I want you to sit with a number for a second, because I think it changes how the rest of this story lands. By the 1300s and 1400s across large parts of Europe, a bed had quietly become one of the single most valuable objects a household could own. Not the house itself in many cases, not even the land. The bed. Wealthy families dressed theirs in silk velvet, imported fur and thread, spun with actual gold, and then did something that sounds almost backward to modern ears. They put their finest bed on display downstairs in the main room, where guests were received not tucked away in a private bedroom at all. Visitors would sit near it, admire it, sometimes even conduct business in its shadow, all while the household's actual sleeping happened somewhere else entirely on far humbler furniture upstairs. The best bed in the house was less a place to sleep, and more a very expensive way of announcing exactly how well the household was doing, whether anyone ever slept in it or not. If that sounds a little theatrical to you, wait until you hear about the bed built specifically to become famous. But before we get there, it is worth asking a simple question. Why would a piece of furniture cost so much in the first place? A proper bed frame of this period was not something one person knocked together in an afternoon. It needed a skilled carpenter to carve and join the wooden frame, often decorated with the same kind of detailed woodwork found in church furniture. It needed a mattress stuffed with wool, or feathers sewn by hand restuffed periodically as it flattened. It needed curtains and hangings woven from imported fabric, sometimes dyed with pigments, shipped in from distant ports, sewn together by yet another specialist entirely. A single bed fully furnished might represent the combined labour of a carpenter, a weaver, a dyer, and an upholsterer assembled into one object that a family would then use repair and hand down for generations rather than replace. Buying a new one from scratch was rarely simple. It was closer to commissioning a small building. Grander frames were even built to come apart entirely. Posts, headboard, and rails fitting together with wooden pegs rather than nails, so a wealthy household moving between properties could pack their finest bed onto a cart and reassemble it somewhere else, the way you might move a piece of real furniture today rather than simply buy new when you arrive. Sometime around 1590, a carpenter working in a small English town called Ware built a bed so enormous it defies easy comparison even now. We're talking roughly 11 feet wide, large enough, according to the boasts of the period, to sleep 4 couples comfortably side by side without anyone so much as brushing elbows. It was built for an inn purely as a novelty, the 16th century equivalent of a roadside attraction, something to make travellers stop, stare, and tell their friends about the ridiculous bed they slept in on the way to Cambridge. It worked spectacularly well. A travelling German prince passing through Ware in the early 1590s was apparently so struck by the thing that he described it in his own travel diary, written in a verse, marvelling that 4 full couples could reportedly lie side by side across its width without ever once touching each other. Word spread from there. Guests carved their initials directly into the headboard. Others pressed hot wax seals into the wood, leaving a little personal mark behind the Elizabethan version of scratching your name into a tourist landmark. Innkeepers in the same town apparently squabbled over who got to display it, moving the enormous thing between establishments the way a modern town might fight over hosting a famous festival. The bed became so well known that William Shakespeare himself referenced it in one of his plays, having a character measure something absurdly oversized by comparing it directly to, in his words, the bed of Ware. Ben Jonson mentioned it too in his own comedy a few years later. Byron was still writing about it more than 2 centuries after that. Here is the part that still makes me smile every time I think about it. That bed is not lost to history, not tucked away in some private collection, not reduced to a footnote in an old inventory somewhere. It is sitting right now in a museum in London behind protective rope-carved initials, and all purchased decades ago for a sum so large it briefly made it the most expensive single piece of furniture that particular museum had ever acquired. A novelty item built to sell beer and gossip at a country inn somehow outlasted the inn itself by roughly 4 centuries. Have you ever carved your initials somewhere you probably were not supposed to? A park bench, a school desk, the inside of a wardrobe nobody checks. If so, take some small comfort in knowing you are continuing a tradition that technically has royal literary approval behind it. Somewhere a piece of oak from Hertfordshire is still holding on to somebody's initials from before your country existed. Now back to that will and that one particular sentence. William Shakespeare, dying in the spring of 1616, left behind a document dividing up his considerable estate among his children, his sister, and various friends. Buried near the very end, almost as an afterthought in tone if not in placement, sits a single line concerning his wife Anne. He left her, in his own words, his second-best bed complete with its furnishings. For centuries that line has been treated as one of the great insults in literary history. A man famous for writing some of the most devoted love poetry in the English language, apparently unable to spare his own wife of 34 years anything more than his hand-me-down furniture. It's a story that writes itself honestly, and generations of biographers repeated it with real relish. But here is where a little historical context completely rearranges the picture. Remember that best bed I mentioned earlier, the one families displayed downstairs to impress visitors? That custom did not disappear by Shakespeare's lifetime. It was still very much alive, which means the best bed in most Elizabethan households, including his own most likely, was not the bed anyone actually slept in most nights. It was the showpiece reserved for guests admired rather than used. The second best bed, by contrast, was almost certainly the real marital bed, the one Shakespeare and Anne had shared, the one where their 3 children had most likely been born. Suddenly leaving her the second best bed does not sound like an insult at all. It sounds like leaving her the one object in the entire house that actually meant something. There is a second layer to this too, one that rarely makes it into the popular version of the story. Under the law of the period, a wife was already legally entitled to a portion of her husband's estate, and the continued use of the family home for the rest of her life, whether his will specifically mentioned her or not. Anne was never actually at risk of losing everything, so why single out one particular bed by name at all? Modern researchers examining the original document using infrared and X-ray technology on the anniversary of Shakespeare's death found something quietly moving. That specific clause about the bed appears to have been added to the will only a few weeks before he died, not as part of the original draft. In other words, a dying man revising his final wishes made a deliberate late addition to specifically name the one piece of furniture that had shared 34 years of an actual marriage with him. Does that sound like spite to you? It certainly does not sound that way to me anymore. Here is something I find fascinating, and I promise this connects. Long before Shakespeare ever picked up a pen, English custom already had a strange habit of dividing a dead person's most valuable possessions into exactly 2 tiers. Under an old feudal practice called heriot, a local lord held the right to claim the single best animal or chattel a tenant owned the moment that tenant died, a horse, an ox, whatever represented the peak of a family's modest wealth. The church, meanwhile, often claimed something too, a duty called a mortuary payment, and since the very best possession had usually already been claimed by the lord, church officials frequently settled quite literally for the second best animal a family owned instead. Picture a grieving widow standing in her own farmyard watching 2 separate men from 2 separate institutions walk off with 2 separate animals on the very same afternoon she buried her husband. Best goes to one party, second best goes to another. That exact pattern had been baked into English inheritance custom for centuries before Shakespeare ever wrote a single word. By his own lifetime, a working playwright was no longer bound by these particular feudal dues in any direct sense. He owed no lord a heriot, no parish a mortuary beast. But the underlying habit of language and the underlying logic of it, best to one second, best to another, had already soaked into the culture around him for generations. By the time an Elizabethan audience heard the phrase second best anything inside a legal document, it likely did not sound careless or petty to their ears at all. It sounded familiar. It sounded in its own strange way deliberate and formal, the language of something being handled properly rather than something being thrown away. I think part of why this single sentence has survived 4 centuries of argument is that it sits right at the crack between 2 very different lives. Shakespeare spent most of his working years in London writing and performing, while Anne remained back in Stratford, running an actual household, raising their children, managing a life that never once needed a theatre audience to feel real. We know almost nothing else about what passed between them. Personally, no surviving letters, no private diary entries, nothing beyond property records and a handful of legal documents. Which means this one small specific bequest, oddly enough, might be the closest thing we have to an actual love letter, whether he intended it that way or not. I am not the only person who has looked at this old bequest and wanted to imagine something tender hiding inside it. Centuries later, a poet gave Anne her own voice, entirely, writing an entire poem from her perspective, reimagining that second best bed not as an insult at all, but as the place where their real life together actually happened, full of memory and warmth, while the good bed sat downstairs collecting compliments from guests who barely mattered. Let's step outside literary London for a moment, though, because I do not want you walking away thinking this was purely a wealthy person's drama. Look through the surviving wills of ordinary farmers and labourers from roughly the same period, and you will often find something almost startling in its simplicity. A cooking pot, a cow if the family was lucky enough to own one, and a bed named specifically, sometimes described down to the exact blanket or bolster included with it. For families with almost nothing else worth writing down, the bed was frequently the only possession significant enough to earn a mention at all passed deliberately to one particular child, rather than divided evenly precisely, because there was often no way to divide a single bed fairly among several children in the first place. More often than not, that particular child was a daughter, and the bed travelled with her into her own marriage as part of her dowry, sometimes the single largest gift she brought into a new household. A mother's feather bed, her linens, her carved bolster quietly becoming the literal foundation of her daughter's own married life a generation later. Grand as Shakespeare's story sounds, this quieter version, mother to daughter, bed to bed, probably happened far more often in far more households across far more forgotten names than his, So maybe that is the real lesson tucked inside 4 centuries of arguing over one dead playwright's furniture choices. We are remarkably quick to find insult in a single line pulled out of context, especially when the fuller picture requires a little patience and a little research to actually see. History rarely hands out its meaning easily. It usually requires someone willing to check the second sentence before reacting to the first. A bed named specifically in a will, whether belonging to a struggling farmer or England's most celebrated writer, was rarely a careless afterthought. It was usually the opposite. It was the one object worth naming on purpose. But naming a bed in a will only tells you what happened to it after somebody died. It says nothing at all about who else might have been sharing that same room while its owner was still alive and breathing. Picture that valuable, carefully carved bed one more time, curtains drawn against the draught candle just extinguished. Now picture a second, much smaller bed tucked against the wall a few feet away, near enough to hear every breath, every cough, every restless turn in the dark. Because in most wealthier households of this period, going to bed was almost never something you did entirely alone, and the person a few feet away was very often not family at all. There is a very good chance that somewhere in a grand old house right now, a perfectly ordinary-looking bed is hiding a second, smaller bed directly underneath it, one most visitors would never think to look for tucked into the shadows beneath the frame like a secret nobody bothered to keep. I want to start there tonight with something hidden in plain sight because I think it says more about how people actually lived than almost anything sitting on top of the mattress ever could. Picture a tall, richly dressed 4-poster bed curtains, drawn the kind we have already spent quite a bit of time admiring tonight. Now bend down and look underneath it. In thousands of wealthier homes across England, from roughly the middle of the 1500s onward, you would find exactly this. A low, narrow frame fitted with small wooden wheels tucked completely out of sight during the day. Come nightfall, somebody would kneel down, roll it out from under the grand bed, and unfold a second, much humbler place to sleep near enough to reach out and touch the finer bed beside it. This little rolling frame had a name, actually 2 names, depending on which part of the country you asked. Trundle bed from an old word for wheel, truckle bed from roughly the same root, and the word did not fade quietly into furniture history books either. If you have ever heard somebody describe a person forced to truckle under bowing to someone else's authority, you're still right now using a phrase borrowed directly from a piece of medieval bedroom furniture built for servants, because that is exactly who slept there. Not usually a spouse, most often a personal servant, a valet, a lady's maid, someone whose entire job depended on being near enough to respond the instant they were needed, whether that meant tending a dying fire at 2 a.m. or answering a sudden call for water. Children use these same low frames too, though for a slightly different reason. A toddler somewhere between infancy and about 5 or 6 years old was often tucked into a trundle bed rolled out right beside a parent's own, near enough for a mother to reach down in the dark without ever fully waking, so that a bad dream or a sudden fever could be noticed within seconds, rather than discovered by accident come morning. It was in its own quiet way an early form of the nursery monitor built entirely out of proximity rather than electronics, and it says something rather lovely that the exact same humble piece of furniture could serve both a frightened toddler and a fully grown household servant, depending entirely on whose safety happened to matter most in that particular room. We actually have a precise little snapshot of this arrangement thanks to record-keeping nobody at the time intended to leave behind for us. In 1582, a wealthy English gentleman named Thomas Offley had his bedroom formally inventoried room by item, the sort of dry administrative document historians secretly treasure. Alongside the bedstead, the wool mattress, the feather bolster, the embroidered coverlet stitched with flowers, sits one small, easy-to-miss entry. A truckle bed for his servant. Not hidden, not embarrassing. simply listed matter-of-factly as part of the furniture of an ordinary bedroom belonging to an ordinary, moderately wealthy man. Is it strange to imagine falling asleep every night with an employee curled up a few feet from your own head? Maybe to us. But to a household of this period, having someone sleeping nearby was not an invasion of privacy at all. Privacy as we understand and guard it today was barely a concept yet. Being surrounded while you slept was simply what safety looked like. Think about your own bedroom for a moment. How many locks does your front door have? How many of those locks would matter at all if you truly believed deep down that another set of watchful eyes in the room mattered more than any bolt or chain? For most of history, that second option was simply the more reliable one. This habit did not disappear quickly either. Reach forward more than a century into the diary of one of English history's most famous gossips, the naval administrator Samuel Pepys, and you will find him casually noting, without a hint of embarrassment, evenings when his own maidservant slept in the same room as him and his wife. He mentions it the same way he mentions what he had for supper that night, or which neighbour annoyed him at church, tucked in among 1,000 other small, unremarkable details of ordinary London life, not scandalous to him, not even worth much comment, simply Tuesday once again, in a household still organised around proximity rather than isolation. Of course, not every household arranging its sleep this way was doing it for the same reason. Wealthier families like Offleys or Pepers's chose proximity as a form of service and status. One more small proof that they could afford somebody whose entire job was simply being nearby. Poorer families rarely had that particular luxury of choice. When an entire household, parents, grandparents, and half a dozen children shared 1 or 2 beds under a single roof, it was not a decision about safety or prestige at all. It was arithmetic. There simply was not enough house or enough furniture to sleep any other way. The instinct toward closeness looked identical from the outside, a room full of sleeping bodies, but the reasons splitting those two households apart, choice on one side, necessity on the other, could not have been more different. Have you ever shared a hotel room with a total stranger on a group trip gone slightly wrong and felt that particular flavour of awkwardness settle over the room the moment the lights went out? Now imagine that same feeling, except it is not a strange one-night arrangement. It is every single night for years, and nobody in the room considers it unusual at all. Sometimes this arrangement produced moments that feel almost unbearably strange to modern ears. There is a story recorded by the 17th century writer John Aubrey about the day a young man named William Roper came to visit the household of the philosopher and statesman Thomas More, hoping to propose marriage to one of More's daughters, though apparently without any strong preference for which particular daughter he ended up with. According to Aubrey, More simply marched him upstairs to where both young women happened to be sleeping side by side in a truckle bed, and pulled back the covers so Roper could look them over and choose. I will let that sit for a second because it deserves to. 2 teenage sisters asleep in the same small bed pushed against their parents' room, casually inspected like livestock at a market, all because a young suitor could not be bothered to specify a preference beforehand. It is a deeply uncomfortable story by any modern standard, and I do not think softening it does anyone any favours. But it also tells you something honest about how thin the walls of privacy really were in a household like this, walls we now take entirely for granted, built out of habits that most of these families would not have even recognised as walls at all. While we're on the subject of these rope-strung frames, let me clear up something small before it derails the whole conversation later. You've probably heard that the phrase sleep tight comes from tightening the ropes underneath one of these old bed frames before climbing in. It is a wonderful story, tidy visual, easy to repeat at a dinner party. It also is not quite where the phrase actually comes from. Language historians trace tight used this way, back to an older meaning, entirely something closer to soundly, or properly already in use well before rope-framed beds were common at all. I like this correction anyway because even the wrong explanation accidentally points at something true. Those rope frames really did sag with use, and really did need retightening now and then, or the whole sleeping arrangement, servant trundle and all, would slowly sink toward the floor over the course of a few restless weeks. Servants and family were not the only people arranging their sleep around someone else's safety either. Step inside a medieval monastery for a moment, and you will find an entirely different version of the same basic instinct. Monks slept together in long communal dormitories called dorters, often a single unbroken room running the length of the building following rules written centuries earlier by St. Benedict himself. Separate beds, yes, but hardly private ones lined up in open rows under one long roof, a lamp left burning through the night so nobody woke into complete darkness. The monk slept fully dressed, belt still fastened a small practical nod to modesty and readiness alike. And curiously specifically, they were forbidden from bringing a knife to bed with them, a small detail that says a great deal about how seriously medieval institutions took the simple danger of a room full of half-asleep people and sharp objects. Now let's climb all the way to the very top of the social ladder, because the logic of guarded sleep did not stop at wealthy merchants and monasteries. It went all the way to the throne itself, and it produced one of the strangest, most powerful job titles in English history. In the Tudor royal household, one of the single most trusted men at court held a position called Groom of the Stool. His central duty, stripped of any polite phrasing, was to personally attend the king during his most private bodily moments, and to sleep in rooms immediately adjoining the royal bedchamber, always within reach, always on call. To modern ears, that sounds like the least desirable job in the palace. In practice, it was the opposite. Whoever held this position spent more unguarded, unscheduled time with the king than almost anyone else alive, including most of his own advisers. Several grooms of the stool were knighted for their service. One helped manage the king's own royal seal. Access, it turns out, especially the quiet, unglamorous, physically near kind, was its own form of power. That closeness cut both ways, though, and it is worth remembering the danger tucked inside it. One of Henry VIII's grooms of the stool, a man named Sir Henry Norris, was among the courtiers swept up and executed during the collapse of Anne Boleyn's position at court. Sleeping practically inside the walls of royal power meant you rose with the king's favour and fell just as fast when that favour turned. Proximity bought influence. It also removed any distance you might have hidden behind if things went wrong. When Elizabeth I came to the throne, a man attending her in such an intimate capacity was considered completely inappropriate, so the role transformed rather than disappeared, becoming the lady of the bedchamber a position of similar trust held by women, instead filled for years by a woman named Catherine Ashley, who had known and cared for Elizabeth since she was a child. Elizabeth's own ladies-in-waiting, meanwhile, often slept on simple straw pallets laid across the floor of her own chamber, not out of poverty, but out of exactly the same old instinct we've been circling all night. Even a queen guarded day and night by soldiers at every gate of the palace apparently still wanted a familiar body breathing nearby in the dark. Isn't that worth sitting with for a moment? All that armour, all those guards stationed outside every door, and the final layer of security a monarch actually chose for herself was simply another human being near enough to hear if something went wrong. We like to imagine we have outgrown this particular instinct technology, having solved it for us. But have we actually? Think about how many people now sleep with the phone within arm's reach, partly out of habit, partly, if we are honest, because some old half-buried part of the brain still wants something nearby that can respond if the night goes wrong. We have swapped a servant on a rolling frame for a baby monitor, A security camera, a smart lock that pings your phone the moment somebody opens the front door after dark. Different century, remarkably similar instinct, just wearing a quieter, more battery-powered disguise. Even people who live entirely alone by choice will often admit, if you ask them honestly, that the first night in a new house always feels a little more unsettled than the 100th, as though some ancient, unreasonable part of the mind is still waiting for a familiar sound of breathing somewhere nearby, before it will fully let go and sleep. It would be easy to look back at all of this and assume it was purely about control wealthy people, ordering servants to sleep at their feet, like something out of a grim historical drama. Some of it certainly was. But threaded all through it in the inventory, listing a servant's truckle bed as casually as a coverlet in Pepys, barely mentioning his maid sharing the room in a Queen's Own household, still choosing company over isolation. Despite every guard money could buy, there is something gentler too. A very old, very human refusal to face the complete darkness of night, entirely alone, dressed up, depending on the century, as duty as status, or simply as common sense. None of which explains yet exactly what any of these people, master or servant, king or groom, were actually lying on once the candle went out, and the whole exhausted household finally settled in for the night. Because underneath every one of those carved frames and rolling trundles sat something far less glamorous, something that shaped daily life in ways none of these grand titles ever could. Every single person we have talked about tonight, poor or wealthy family or servant, king or groom, shared exactly one problem in common, and it had nothing to do with class at all. It had everything to do with what was actually stuffed inside the mattress, underneath them, hidden under every layer of embroidered linen and carved oak we have admired so far tonight. Let's start at the bottom of the social ladder, because that is truly where this story has to begin. If you were poor in medieval or early modern Europe, your bed, if you could call it that, was most likely a canvas or linen sack stuffed with straw, laid directly on the floor or across a simple wooden frame. No springs, obviously. No padding beneath it. Just dried plant stalks packed down flatter every single night by the weight of an exhausted body, until somebody eventually got around to pulling it apart and restuffing it, which for most families happened maybe once a year, if that. Picture the sound alone, every small shift in sleep answered by a dry papery rustle, loud enough that entire households must have learned to sleep straight through it without a second thought, the way we now sleep through traffic outside a window. One level up among what we might loosely call the middling sort, merchants, skilled tradesmen, better off farmers, the mattress filling upgraded slightly to something called flock, which was simply leftover scraps of wool, the offcuts and waste from cloth production too rough to weave into anything but soft enough to sleep on. These flock mattresses were considered valuable enough that families actually wrote them into their wills by name, the same way we saw beds themselves treated as heirlooms earlier tonight. And then right at the top sat the feather bed, the true luxury item of the pre-industrial bedroom. Goose down and duck feathers saved patiently over years, sometimes plucked from the very bird served at a family's own dinner table, and packed into an enormous fabric case laid directly on top of a firmer straw or wool mattress underneath. A proper feather bed did not replace the firmer layers beneath it. It floated on top of them, a soft luxury balanced over a practical foundation, which is a metaphor I will let you sit with for a moment if you want one. Quick question, and be honest with yourself for a second. When you picture a truly luxurious bed, do goose feathers even cross your mind anymore? Or has memory foam and high thread, Count Cotton, completely replaced that particular fantasy? 5 centuries ago, a feather bed was not a metaphor for comfort. It was quite literally the single most comfortable object most people would ever be allowed to touch in their entire lives. Here is a small detail I find quietly hilarious. Around 1580, an English clergyman named William Harrison sat down and wrote with the particular grumpiness only a certain kind of older gentleman can summon about how soft his own generation had apparently become. In his younger years, he complained a newly married man who could scrape together enough money for a proper mattress and a sack of chaff to rest his head on within 7 years of his wedding day considered himself as comfortable as a lord. Servants meanwhile counted themselves lucky if they merely had a single sheet thrown over them at night, with nothing at all softening the straw underneath, which he notes rather bluntly had a habit of pricking straight through to their skin. Every single generation, it turns out, has had somebody sitting in the corner muttering about how spoiled young people have become with their fancy new mattresses. If William Harrison were alive today, I suspect he would have quite a lot to say about memory foam commercials. Have you ever laid awake wondering exactly how firm a mattress should be, scrolling through reviews at midnight trying to decide between soft, medium and firm? Take some comfort tonight in knowing that people have been anxiously negotiating this exact question for at least 500 years, just with straw and goose feathers instead of gel-infused foam. Now, softness was never the only concern hiding inside these mattresses, and this is where the story gets considerably less pleasant, though I promise it is worth knowing anyway. Straw, wool and feathers all share one unfortunate quality. They make an absolutely perfect home for fleas, lice and bed bugs. Historical accounts from across medieval and early modern Europe describe these pests as simply a normal expected part of sleeping, rather than some rare misfortune. People fought back as best they could, scattering wormwood among the bedding, sprinkling ashes around the frame, tightly weaving the fabric casing known as ticking, in an attempt to keep the smallest pests from working their way through the seams. Wealthier households stored spare bedding inside cedar chests, since the wood's natural scent seemed to discourage at least some of the worst offenders. Wealth did not eliminate the problem, but it absolutely softened it. A well-off household could afford servants whose regular duties included dragging every mattress outside, beating the dust and insects out of it in the open air, then airing the whole thing in direct sunlight for hours before hauling it back inside. A poorer family working from dawn until exhausted rarely had a spare set of hands or a spare afternoon to manage that same ritual with any regularity. The bugs themselves did not discriminate by class in the slightest. The ability to fight back against them, on the other hand, absolutely did. Even royalty was not exempt, though royalty predictably handled the problem with considerably more resources than everyone else. Henry VIII reportedly had his own straw mattress replaced every single day, a level of obsessive freshness available to essentially nobody else in the kingdom, where most people's mattresses saw a full replacement only once a year, if they were fortunate enough to have the material and the time to spare for it. I want you to sit with that gap for a second. One man's bedding refreshed daily purely for his own comfort. Everyone else quite literally living with the same handful of bugs for months at a stretch, and mostly just accepting it the way you might accept a noisy radiator or a squeaky floorboard today, an annoyance too constant and too ordinary to actually fight. It was not only what people slept on that harboured all of this either. It was frequently what they walked on too. Wealthier medieval homes commonly covered their floors with loose rushes, sweet-smelling reeds scattered thickly across bare stone or packed earth, mixed with fragrant herbs like lavender, chamomile, and dried rose petals specifically to mask whatever was accumulating underneath. And accumulating is putting it politely. The Dutch scholar Erasmus, visiting England in the early 1500s, wrote a rather unforgettable account of exactly what tended to build up beneath those pleasant-smelling floor coverings, over time describing layer upon layer, left undisturbed for years, quietly absorbing spilled ale kitchen scraps, and considerably worse while fresh rushes were simply piled on top, rather than the old ones ever being properly cleared away. By his account, a single floor covering in the worst-kept households might go entirely undisturbed at its base for 2 full decades. To be fair to Elizabethan housekeeping, that habit was already starting to fall out of fashion by the end of the century, as woven rush matting easier to lift clean and replace as a single piece slowly began replacing the loose scattered version in wealthier homes. But change like that moves slowly through a population, and for most of the period we're discussing tonight, a great many English floors were in the most literal sense possible, quietly composting underfoot. So the room you were falling asleep in and the surface you were falling asleep on were both in their own separate ways small, slowly accumulating ecosystems. Comfortable ecosystems in the case of a proper featherbed, but ecosystems nonetheless. Which finally brings us to those heavy fabric curtains hanging around the grandest beds of the period, the ones we have already admired more than once tonight, without quite asking what they were actually for. The whole structure had a name too, by the way, a wooden or fabric canopy suspended above the bed called a tester, from which the curtains themselves hung down on every side, sometimes in wool serge, sometimes in velvet, occasionally an imported silk for the households who could afford to advertise it. It is tempting to assume they existed purely for show, one more expensive way of announcing wealth, and to some extent sure that is part of it. But curtains drawn tightly around a bed frame were doing real practical work too. Stone castle walls in winter could turn a bedroom brutally cold overnight, and a fully enclosed bed curtains pulled shut on every side trapped a person's own body heat inside a much smaller pocket of air, functioning less like decoration and more like an early textile version of a sleeping bag. Those same curtains also caught falling dust insects and debris that had a habit of drifting down from open-beamed or thatched ceilings above an unglamorous but truly useful second job for what looked from the outside like pure luxury. And there was a third function too, one that connects directly back to everything we talked about only a few minutes ago. In a household where a servant slept on a truckle bed only a few feet away, where children shared the same room where an entire family might sleep within arm's reach of each other every single night, those curtains were often the only real privacy anyone actually had. Not a locked door, not a separate room, just a thin wall of fabric pulled shut, offering the barest illusion of being alone, and apparently that illusion mattered enough to build an entire architectural tradition around it. Draw those curtains at night, and for a few hours whatever happened on the other side of that fabric, a whispered conversation, a private argument, a moment of grief nobody else needed to witness, belonged to nobody but the people inside. It was privacy built entirely out of etiquette and cloth, rather than walls, and everybody in the room understood and respected it anyway, which tells you something rather touching about how badly people wanted that boundary to exist, even when they could not afford the architecture to make it real. Here is something else worth knowing, a small etymological detail I happen to love. The very word mattress did not originate in Europe at all. It traces back to the Arabic word matra, meaning something thrown down or laid out. European crusaders travelling through the Islamic world starting in the 11th century encountered an entirely different approach to sleeping cushions and mats, arranged directly on the floor, rather than elevated on a wooden frame, and brought the word home with them, even as they mostly kept their own raised beds, rather than adopting the floor cushions themselves. So every time an English speaker uses the word mattress, they are unknowingly borrowing a term from a tradition of sleeping on the ground to describe an object that in Europe at least was specifically built to lift a person up and away from it. Isn't that a strange little contradiction to carry around in a single word for 800 years, without anyone noticing? Words travel a great deal further than the customs they originally described, picking up new meanings and shedding old ones the way a traveller sheds one country's currency for another's. Nobody drawing their bed curtains shut in an English manor house was thinking about desert cushions or crusading armies. The word had simply become theirs, stripped of its original context, carrying only the faintest echo of where it came from. Whether you were sleeping on a bag of straw directly on packed earth, or beneath a canopy stuffed with duck feathers and surrounded by silk curtains, the underlying goal, when you strip away every difference in wealth, was exactly the same. Stay warm, stay reasonably clean, or at least clean enough to manage. Keep some small, fragile sense of privacy intact, even inside a house crowded with other bodies. Money changed the materials involved dramatically. It never changed what people were actually trying to accomplish once the candle went out. It is easy from a comfortable distance of several centuries to look back at all of this straw and flock and honest infestation, and feel a kind of superior pity for how these people lived. I would gently push back on that instinct. Nobody sleeping inside a curtained bed on a feather mattress in 1590 felt deprived. They felt by the standards available to them warm-sheltered, and about as comfortable as a human being could reasonably expect to be. Comfort has never been an absolute measurement. It has always been relative to whatever came before it, which is worth remembering the next time your own mattress feels slightly less than perfect. 3 centuries from now, somebody telling this same kind of story might describe our own beds with exactly the same mixture of fascination and mild horror. We have been aiming at straw and flock tonight, wondering how anyone ever managed to sleep well without whatever comfort technology their own century has quietly learned to take for granted. All of which worked reasonably well, more or less, as long as you were sleeping inside your own home, surrounded by your own particular set of fleas, and your own particular arrangement of curtains and family. The moment you had to travel and sleep somewhere else entirely in a bed that belonged to a complete stranger, every single one of these careful arrangements fell apart, and an entirely different, considerably stranger set of rules took over instead. The first rule, and the single most important one, was disturbingly simple. You did not get to choose who you slept next to. Step outside your own front door for a moment, away from the familiar mattress, the familiar fleas, the familiar arrangement of family and servants we've already spent tonight getting to know. The instant you became a traveller, all of that carefully built familiarity vanished, replaced by muddy roads, unfamiliar towns, and an innkeeper you'd never met sizing you up in a doorway by candlelight. And you were handed over entirely to the mercy of whichever inn happened to have a bed free that particular evening. A bed free rarely meant a bed to yourself. For most of medieval and early modern Europe, inns simply did not have enough private rooms to guarantee every guest their own space, and nobody particularly expected them to. If you arrived late, or the roads had been busy that week, or a fair happened to be passing through town, the innkeeper's honest answer to your request for a room was often not no. It was, "We have a bed, but you will be sharing it specifically with a complete stranger you had never met before that moment, and would very likely never see again after the following morning." In some English towns, this was not simply custom. It was written directly into local law. Certain municipal bylaws actually required innkeepers to provide a bed to any respectable traveller who asked for one, whether or not a private room happened to be available that night. If every private chamber was full, the innkeeper's legal obligation did not disappear. It simply meant finding room in somebody else's bed instead, and finding it quickly, before an exhausted traveller decided to take his complaint and his coin to a competing inn down the road. Now, before your imagination runs somewhere unpleasant, I want to walk you through exactly how this actually worked, because it was considerably more organised and considerably less chaotic than it probably sounds at first. Bedfellows were as a rule matched by sex travellers of the same gender, placed together with innkeepers generally taking real care to keep men and women, unless they were travelling as an actual married couple, in entirely separate beds and separate rooms. An innkeeper's entire livelihood depended on repeat business and a decent reputation along the road, which meant pairing bedfellows badly or carelessly was simply bad for business, quite apart from being bad manners. And once you were paired off with your stranger for the night, there existed a genuine, widely understood code of conduct for how to behave unwritten, in most cases, but absolutely real. Stay on your own half of the mattress. Do not steal the blankets. Lie reasonably still, since a restless bedfellow tossing and turning all night was quite reasonably considered rude. Conversation was welcome if both parties felt like talking, but nobody was owed a chat simply because they happened to share a mattress with you. A bedfellow who snored, kicked or hogged more than their fair share of blanket earned exactly the same quiet, long-suffering resentment then that they would earn from any of us today, the only real difference being that complaining about it to the innkeeper the next morning was roughly the closest thing available to a bad review. Doesn't that sound almost eerily familiar? Have you ever stayed in a hostel dormitory, or shared a sleeper cabin on an overnight train with someone you had just met an hour earlier, following the exact same unspoken rules? Stay quiet, stay on your side, do not make this weirder than it needs to be. We like to imagine we invented awkward travel etiquette somewhere around the invention of the backpacker hostel. In reality, we simply reinvented something that had already been running smoothly for a few hundred years, right down to the mild, silent judgment reserved for whoever turns out to be the noisy one. The quality of all of this predictably depended entirely on how much money you had in your pocket. At the very bottom end of the market, a traveller with only a few coins to spare might pay for nothing more than a thin mat laid directly on a dirt floor, shared with whichever other travellers happened to have equally empty pockets that night, alongside a heel of coarse bread and a bowl of thin, watery pottage to keep you going until morning. One step up, and you might find a proper dormitory room, straw pallets or simple rope-strung beds lined up in rows shared among several travellers rather than the entire common room. And right at the top for merchants and nobility, who could actually afford it, a private chamber, waited complete with a feather mattress, sometimes even a small fireplace glazed windows to keep the draught out, and crucially a door that actually locked. That lockable door, more than the fireplace, more than the feathers, was very likely the single most valuable luxury money could buy on the road. Everyone else was trusting a room full of strangers, an innkeeper's judgment and simple good manners to get them safely through the night. Women travelling this same road faced an additional layer of complication entirely their own. A woman lodging at an inn completely alone was considered unusual enough that innkeepers and society generally tended to raise an eyebrow at it, which meant most women travelled in the company of family servants, or other women rather than solo. That did not mean women simply stayed home, though whatever popular imagination might assume. Research into surviving Privy Council travel licenses from the Tudor period has turned up dozens of English women sometimes travelling in organised groups, formally granted permission to journey abroad, many of them heading specifically toward a particular town on the continent known for its healing waters, considered unusually welcoming toward female visitors compared to most other destinations of the period. Pilgrims' merchants' wives managing business abroad, diplomat spouses running entire foreign households, women were very much part of this travelling bed-sharing world. They simply navigated it as women so often have throughout history, with an additional set of careful precautions men rarely needed to think about at all. Things could apparently get considerably more extreme than a shared mattress too if your pockets were empty enough. Centuries later, in the crowded lodging houses of Victorian London, the very poorest travellers occasionally paid a couple of pennies, not for a bed at all, but simply for the right to lean forward over a horizontal rope strung across a room at roughly chest height, resting their arms and upper body against it, while they slept sitting up packed shoulder to shoulder with total strangers along the same length of rope. This was not some obscure rumour either. Charles Dickens described it in one of his novels in the 1830s, and nearly a century later George Orwell wrote about experiencing something remarkably similar, first-hand describing lodgers leaning on a rope the way you might lean against a fence, until a man Orwell Riley called the valet cut the rope loose at 5 a.m, dropping everyone back into their day whether they were ready or not. Come morning, the rope was simply untied, releasing everyone at once the way you might release a row of coats from a single rack. It sounds almost too grim to be real, and yet it was simply the furthest end of a spectrum that had already existed for centuries. The same basic instinct we have been tracing all night: share what space there is, no matter how uncomfortable, rather than have no shelter at all. Let me give you my favourite example of all of this in action, though it comes from considerably later than most of what we've discussed tonight, and involves two men history remembers rather well. In September of 1776, in the middle of the American Revolution, a small delegation set out from Philadelphia towards Staten Island, hoping ultimately without success to negotiate an early end to the war with the British. Among the travellers were Benjamin Franklin, already an old man by the standards of the day, and John Adams, younger, considerably more anxious and famously particular about his health. Passing through a town in New Jersey, the delegation discovered every inn in the area completely full-packed, with soldiers, merchants, and fellow travellers, all competing for the same scarce handful of beds. The best anyone could arrange was a single small chamber, barely larger than the bed crammed inside it, with no fireplace, and only one small window, and exactly one bed for both Franklin and Adams to share. What followed, according to Adams' own diary, was not a peaceful night's sleep. It was an argument. Adams, thoroughly convinced that cold night air caused illness, moved to shut the tiny window before either man attempted to sleep. Franklin, who held rather unconventional opinions about fresh air for a man of his century, sprang up immediately and told him not to, warning that the two of them would suffocate if the room stayed sealed. The two future founding figures of an entire nation lay side by side in the dark, arguing about a half-open window. Franklin apparently launching into a lengthy, enthusiastic explanation of his personal theories on cold's respiration and the supposed benefits of fresh evening air, until Adams, by his own account, simply found the whole lecture soothing enough to fall asleep in the middle of it. The window, for what it is worth, stayed open all night. Neither man caught a cold. Both were up again by morning, continuing on toward a peace negotiation that would ultimately fail anyway. I love this story precisely because of how ordinary it is underneath all that historical weight. Two men who would go on to help write the founding documents of an entire country, reduced for one night to exactly the kind of petty, relatable squabble anyone who has ever shared a room with a sibling, a roommate, or a partner will recognize instantly. History rarely lets its biggest names look quite this human. I am always a little grateful when it does. Here is a question worth turning over for a second. Which sounds more uncomfortable to you tonight, sharing a single bed with a complete stranger from a random inn, or sharing one with a colleague you know well, who insists on keeping the window open all night against your explicit wishes? I am honestly not sure the stranger is the worse option. It would be easy to look at all of this strangers packed into shared beds up and down every well-travelled road in Europe and colonial America, and assume it must have been lawless, dangerous, bordering on chaos. Mostly it was not. It was regulated, expected, and governed by manners just as real, if considerably less documented, as anything written into a formal law book. Innkeepers built their entire reputations on judging character at the door, and pairing bedfellows sensibly. Travellers relied on that judgment because quite simply they had no better option, and the system worked well enough for long enough across enough centuries that it left behind diary entries like John Adams's rather than countless horror stories. Inns were never the only option on the road either. Monasteries across medieval Europe were bound by their own religious duty to offer hospitality to travellers, regardless of whether the traveller could pay for it. That hospitality predictably still bent itself around social rank. A nobleman or a member of the higher clergy passing through might find himself sharing the abbot's own private lodgings, for the night treated almost as an honoured guest. A traveller arriving on horseback, respectable but less exalted, was usually shown to a proper guest house. Anyone arriving on foot, the pilgrims, the poor, the simply unlucky, was directed straight to the communal dormitory sharing space with whichever other travellers the monastery had already taken in that day. Even an institution built entirely around charity, it turns out still found a way to sort its guests by status before anyone's head hit the pillow. Between commercial inns paying strangers by the bed, and monasteries sorting travellers by rank before showing them to a dormitory, medieval Europe had built almost without anyone planning it. Centrally, an entire informal network for keeping people housed and reasonably safe on the road. It was imperfect. It was occasionally uncomfortable. But it worked consistently enough across enough centuries that ordinary people kept travelling anyway, trusting the system one stranger, one shared mattress at a time. There is something almost touching in a strange way about how much trust that system actually required from complete strangers. You handed your unconscious, defenceless self over to a person you had known for less than an hour, based on nothing more than an innkeeper's word and a shared understanding of basic manners. We have engineered nearly all of that necessity out of modern travel private rooms, keycard locks, apps that let us review a host before we ever knock on their door. And yet the underlying trade a stranger's word for a safe night's sleep has never entirely disappeared. It just moved online dressed up in star ratings and verified profile photos instead of an innkeeper's reputation along the road. Book an overnight train or a shared hostel bunk or even carpool through a rideshare app tonight, and you are quietly relying on the exact same ancient transaction, a system of strangers trusting other strangers, because the alternative was, and still is, simply staying home, none of which tells you what actually happened once both strangers, having negotiated their side of the mattress and settled their disagreements about open windows, finally shut their eyes. Because whether you were sleeping beside your own spouse, a servant on a trundle bed, or a total stranger from 3 towns over there was still one more visitor. Everyone quietly worried about one that had nothing to do with who was sharing your bed and everything to do with what might come looking for you the moment you actually fell asleep. Say the word nightmare out loud slowly and notice what your mind automatically reaches for. A dark horse probably galloping somewhere out of the fog, maybe with wild eyes and flared nostrils. Almost everyone pictures a horse. And almost everyone, it turns out, has the word completely wrong. The mare in Nightmare has nothing to do with horses at all. It comes from an old Germanic word mare, the name people once gave to a very specific kind of demon, a spirit believed to creep into a sleeper's room at night, climb directly onto their chest and sit there heavy and immovable, while the sleeper woke just enough to feel the weight pressing down on them and realize with growing horror that they could not move, could not cry out, could not do anything at all except lie there and endure it. That crushing, breathless, paralyzed sensation was the original nightmare centuries before the word ever softened into meaning simply a bad dream. The horse only wandered into the picture later, an accident of 2 similar-sounding words drifting together in people's minds over time long after anyone remembered what a mare actually was. This was never just an English idea either. Reach across the language map of medieval Europe, and you find the exact same demon wearing a different name in almost every direction. The Germans called it the Nachtmar. The French called it the Cauchemar, a word that literally translates to something like fiend that tramples. Scandinavian languages built entire compound words around the idea of being ridden by it. The Swedish Mardrum, the Danish Merit, both meaning roughly mare ride. Even the Icelandic sagas mention her by name, a figure called Mara, said to ride sleepers the way a rider rides a horse, exhausting them through the night, without ever leaving a mark anyone could point to the next morning. A belief this consistent spread across this many separate languages and this much geography was not some fringe superstition whispered by a handful of frightened villagers. It was closer to a shared, continent-wide diagnosis for one of the strangest sensations a sleeping human body can produce. Here is a question worth sitting with, especially if you're watching this lying down in the dark yourself. Have you ever woken up unable to move, fully conscious, aware of the room around you, but trapped inside a body that simply will not respond sometimes, with the distinct skin-crawling sense that something else is in the room with you? If you have experienced exactly what medieval and early modern people were describing when they talked about being visited by the mare. We now have a clinical name for it: sleep paralysis, and we understand roughly why it happens, a brief overlap between the paralysis your body naturally uses during dreaming to stop you from acting out your dreams and the part of your brain that is already waking up on schedule. But knowing the biology does not necessarily make the sensation feel any less like something is sitting on your chest. People experiencing it today, across wildly different cultures that never shared a word or a folktale with each other, still commonly report the same specific uncanny detail, a sense of a presence in the room watching patient unmoving. I find that detail almost more unsettling than the folklore itself, honestly. An explanation changes across centuries from demon to biology, from folklore to a diagram of brain activity. The actual experience apparently does not change at all. This shared human sensation eventually produced one of the most famous paintings in the history of art, whether the artist intended that or not. In 1781, a Swiss painter named Henry Fuseli unveiled a canvas simply titled The Nightmare, showing a woman collapsed backward across her bed, arms hanging limp toward the floor, head thrown back at an angle no comfortable sleeper would ever choose, while a small grinning gargoyle-like demon crouches directly on her chest, and a wild-eyed horse's head pushes through a gap in the curtains, behind her, staring directly out at whoever happens to be looking at the painting. The painting caused an immediate sensation when it was first shown publicly copied, engraved and reprinted so often across Europe that Fuseli's demon became one of the most recognizable images of the entire 18th century, reproduced on everything from satirical cartoons to political pamphlets that had nothing to do with sleep at all. Part of that popularity, I suspect, came from simple recognition. Not recognition of the demon specifically, recognition of the feeling. Fuseli had somehow put the actual physical sensation of sleep paralysis onto a canvas a full 2 centuries before anyone had a scientific name for it, and audiences who had never once heard the word mare responded to it anyway. Instinctively, the way you respond to a description of something you have quietly experienced yourself, but never had the language to explain. It would be easy to file all of this away as quaint, uneducated fear, the kind of thing frightened peasants believed before science came along and explained it properly. I want to gently push back on that idea because the people taking this most seriously were not uneducated at all. Figures like the theologian Thomas Aquinas, one of the sharpest philosophical minds medieval Europe ever produced, devoted real careful extended argument to exactly how a demon might interact with a sleeping human body, treating the question with the same rigour he applied to far weightier theological problems, working through it across pages of formal argument, rather than dismissing it as folk nonsense unworthy of serious thought. Whatever you think of the conclusions, and plenty of it sounds strange to modern ears, the seriousness behind the questioning was completely real. This was not a fringe belief tolerated at the edges of intellectual life whispered about only in candlelit cottages. For several centuries it sat comfortably inside some of the most respected theological writing produced in Europe, debated by the same minds responsible for shaping church doctrine on subjects we still take seriously today. So if the greatest minds of the age agreed something dangerous might visit you in your sleep, what, practically speaking, was an ordinary person actually supposed to do about it? Before blowing out the candle, quite a lot as it turns out, and some of it has survived in ways you might not expect. One popular defence involved a small unassuming object, a stone with a natural hole worn straight through it, by water known across England as a hagstone. Hung on a cord above the bed, or tied directly to the bedpost so it swayed gently with every draught that slipped under the door, a hagstone was believed to let good intentions pass freely through its hole, while trapping anything malicious on the far side unable to reach the sleeper at all. Some families claimed you could even look through the hole and catch a witch or a spirit in the act momentarily stripped of whatever disguise it was wearing. One of the earliest surviving written charms describing this protection dates back to the 1400s, and the practice did not fade quickly. Folklorists were still recording English families hanging hagstones over beds for exactly this purpose. Well into the 20th century, a truly uninterrupted line of practice stretching across roughly 500 years, from candlelit farmhouses to electrically lit bedrooms that by then had absolutely nothing else in common with the world that first invented the charm. Iron worked its way into the same defensive toolkit too, most famously in the shape of a horseshoe. According to a legend attached to the 10th century St. Dunstan, the devil himself once approached the saint, who also happened to work as a blacksmith in his younger years, and asked to be shod like a horse. Dunstan, recognizing exactly who stood in front of him, agreed without hesitation, and set to work at his forge as though nothing were unusual about the request at all. Rather than nailing the shoe on gently, he drove it in deliberately painfully tight enough that the devil howled and begged for it to be removed at once. Dunstan, ever the shrewd negotiator, refused to take it off until he'd extracted a solemn promise first that the devil would never again enter any home that displayed a horseshoe above its door. Whether or not you believe a single word of that story, and I certainly do not blame you if you don't, people clearly did, hanging horseshoes above doorways and at the foot of beds for centuries afterward, specifically to keep bad dreams and whatever was thought to cause them from ever getting inside in the first place. My favourite protective charm of all, though, comes from a surviving English manuscript catalogued today simply as Sloane Manuscript 962, which preserves a bedtime charm meant to ward off exactly this kind of demonic visitor. Rather than simply commanding the danger away, the charm works by telling a story, invoking the legend of the Seven Sleepers, a group of young Christians who, according to a much older tradition, hid inside a cave to escape religious persecution in the 3rd century, fell asleep, and by most tellings of the legend woke again more than 300 years later, having aged not a single day, protected the entire time by divine favour, while empires rose and fell outside their sealed cave entrance. Reciting their names and their story before bed was believed to extend that same ancient protection to whoever spoke it, a kind of borrowed safety, passed down mouth to mouth for well over 1,000 years, one bedtime at a time. The person murmuring those names by candlelight was not casting a spell in the way we usually picture the word. They were retelling a bedtime story about people who fell asleep safely once hoping the safety might rub off a little, the same way a worried parent today might tell a familiar, comforting story to a frightened child rather than simply telling them to stop being scared. There is something quietly beautiful about that particular charm if you sit with it for a moment more than almost anything else we've touched on tonight. It was not a threat. It was not a command shouted at the darkness. It was simply a story repeated on purpose right before sleep because someone somewhere had decided that a story about people who were kept safe once might help keep you safe too. Manuscripts like Sloane 962 were not the only line of defense either, and you did not need to be a monk copying charms by candlelight to take part in this nightly ritual. Ordinary households across Christian Europe folded a simple prayer into the last few minutes before sleep, as a matter of routine, asking in whatever words a particular family had learned from their own parents for protection through the coming hours of darkness until morning light returned. Some families made the sign of the cross over the bed itself before climbing in. Others kept a small prayer book, or simply a treasured page torn from one tucked near the pillow, less for reading in the dark than for the reassurance of having it nearby. None of this required wealth or education or access to a library of protective manuscripts. It required only the same handful of familiar words repeated quietly night after night by nearly everyone everywhere, for longer than anyone alive today can personally remember. There is something worth noticing in just how universal that instinct turned out to be, by the way. Cultures with no shared language, no shared religion, and no possible way of borrowing folklore from one another still developed remarkably similar responses to this exact sensation: a heavy presence, a paralyzed body, a watching figure in the dark. Communities in Newfoundland spoke of being ridden by the old hag. Parts of Southeast Asia describe something strikingly similar, sitting on a sleeper's chest under an entirely different name. When completely unconnected, cultures independently arrive at nearly the same explanation for the same experience, that is usually a fairly strong hint that the experience itself, whatever you choose to call it, is truly universal to being human, not a quirk belonging to any single time or place. Isn't that, in a strange way, exactly what you're doing right now? Listening to this story instead of lying there in silence with your own thoughts. We may have traded hagstones and half-remembered saints for calm voices and slow narration, but the underlying instinct feels remarkably unchanged. Something in the dark is easier to face with the story wrapped around it. A frightened mind, whether in a candlelit cottage 600 years ago, or in a bedroom lit by nothing but a phone screen tonight, has always reached for the exact same tool. Not a weapon, not a lock on the door, a voice and a story and the simple, stubborn hope that both might carry you safely through until morning. None of this fear was really about horses or demons or even the dark itself if you look closely enough. It was about the one truly defenseless moment every single human being has to pass through night after night, whether they are a king behind a locked door or a farmer sharing straw with the rest of the family. The instant you fall asleep, you hand over control of your body completely with no way to check what happens next until you wake up again. Every charm, every prayer, every hagstone swinging gently from a bedpost was really just one more attempt to answer the same quiet, universal question. Who or what is going to be watching over me while I cannot watch over myself? For most ordinary households, the answer to that question involved whispered charms and borrowed folklore, something private, personal, passed down quietly from one frightened sleeper to the next. But there was an entire institution that answered the exact same question very differently, with far less whispering and considerably more organization ringing bells through the darkest hours of the night, for reasons that had absolutely nothing to do with telling the time. Somewhere in the Alps, starting in the year 522, a chant began that did not stop. Not that night, not the following night, not for roughly the next 380 years. At a monastery called Agaunum in what is now Switzerland, an abbot introduced a practice unlike anything else being done in Western Europe at the time. Instead of gathering to pray at fixed hours and then falling silent in between, the monks divided themselves into rotating choirs, one group singing psalms while another rested, then swapping places the moment the first group finished around the clock, day folding into night, folding into day again, without a single silent gap anywhere in between. Picture it for a second. A stone church tucked into an alpine valley, snow piled outside the windows in winter, and inside, always at every hour, a traveller might happen to pass by the sound of men singing. They called it Laus Perennis, perpetual praise, and the monks who carried it out earned a nickname that has survived far better than most of their actual names, the Sleepless Ones. For roughly 3 centuries, somewhere inside those monastery walls, at any hour you care to imagine, awake or asleep yourself, a voice was singing. I want you to sit with that scale for a second, because it is truly hard to picture. Somewhere around 3 in the morning, 600 years before anyone in that valley owned a mechanical clock, while the rest of the world outside those walls slept through their own first sleep or lay wide awake during the wakeful hour. We talked about earlier tonight a small rotating team of men was standing upright in the dark, chanting precisely because the chanting was never under any circumstances supposed to stop. Most monasteries never attempted anything quite that extreme, thankfully, both for the monks involved and for anyone trying to explain it centuries later. But nearly every monastery in medieval Europe still built its entire day and a significant portion of its night around a structure that would exhaust most of us within a week. The framework came from a document written in the early 500s after the birth of Christ, roughly a full millennium before anyone in Europe would have recognized the word Renaissance, by an Italian monk named Benedict of Nursia, a set of guidelines historians now simply call the rule. Inside it, Benedict laid out 8 separate prayer periods stretched across a single day, each one named, each one timed, each one treated as a genuine, non-negotiable appointment with God rather than a suggestion. Lauds at first light, prime shortly after sunrise, terce, sext and nun marking out the working hours of the day, vespers as the sun went down, Compline right before sleep, closing the day exactly the way it opened with prayer. And then tucked in among all of that, sitting apart from the other 7, came the one period that had nothing to do with daylight at all. Vigils, sometimes called matins, scheduled for roughly 2 in the morning, deep in the heart of the night, timed specifically to fall during the hours everyone else in the surrounding countryside had already been asleep for hours. Why bother? Because Benedict pointed directly at Scripture for his justification. A single line from the Psalms that reads at midnight, "I rise to praise you because of your righteous rules." If the Bible itself described rising at midnight as an act of devotion, Benedict reasoned then a monk seriously committed to that devotion needed to actually do it, not simply admire the sentiment from the comfort of an uninterrupted night's sleep. It is worth saying clearly that this was never an exclusively male discipline either. Benedict originally wrote his rule with monks in mind, but communities of nuns adopted it almost immediately, keeping the exact same 8 hours, waking for the exact same vigils in the exact same freezing darkness, often with even less historical record left behind to prove it. Whatever exhaustion, whatever quiet, spiritual satisfaction came from that nightly discipline, women experienced every bit of it too across just as many centuries in convents that rarely get mentioned in the same breath as their better documented male counterparts. Picture what that actually meant in practice for a moment before we get lost in the theology of it. Monks slept fully clothed by explicit instruction in Benedict's own rule, not for warmth alone, but so that when the bell finally rang, nobody wasted precious minutes getting dressed in the dark. One monk, usually called the sacrist, kept his own separate sleeping quarters, specifically so he could rise earlier than everyone else and ring that bell on schedule, while another known as the cirkeeter patrolled the dormitory through the night, checking that nobody was talking and that no illicit candle was burning somewhere it shouldn't be. Somewhere past midnight in a dormitory with no fireplace lit by nothing but a single lamp left burning, so nobody woke into total darkness, an entire community of men had to be roused from real deep sleep and make their way already dressed to a cold stone chapel to sing psalms from memory, because before the widespread use of wax candles, reading by lamplight in a chapel this size simply was not practical. Monks were expected to know an enormous portion of the Psalter by heart, specifically so the night office could proceed without needing enough light to see the page at all. Imagine memorizing dozens of psalms, not for an exam, not for a performance, but because your entire community's ability to keep its nightly promise to God depended on nobody needing to squint at a page in the dark. Benedict, to his credit, was not entirely without mercy about the difficulty of this. His rule specifically allows for shortened readings on the nights a community happens to wake up late, though the psalms themselves were never to be cut short, only the surrounding readings and responses. And if a monk's own carelessness caused that lateness, Benedict's rule notes rather sternly that the responsible party owed an apology to God delivered right there in the chapel in front of everyone. Even a monastery deeply devoted to humility apparently still had room for a little public accountability when someone slept through their alarm. There was a gentler side to all this discipline too worth mentioning before we move on. After compline the final prayer of the day, the entire monastery settled into something called the Great Silence, a strict, unbroken quiet that lasted from that final evening prayer until the first service the following morning. Nobody spoke. Nobody was meant to, beyond the words of the liturgy itself. It was not simply a rule against chatter. It was meant to protect the last few hours before vigils as something sacred and undisturbed, a small mercy tucked inside an otherwise unforgiving schedule, ensuring that whatever brief real sleep a monk did get was at least sleep nobody would interrupt on purpose. Here's a detail I find quietly remarkable, and it connects directly to something we discussed earlier tonight. Benedict was not oblivious to the toll this took on ordinary sleep. In winter, when nights stretched long, vigils came after a properly full night's rest, roughly 8 hours, with the office scheduled late enough that monks were not simply being dragged out of the deepest part of their sleep. But in summer, when the gap between sunset and sunrise shrank dramatically, there was no way to fit a full 8 hours in before vigils without pushing the office absurdly late. Benedict's solution was almost tender, honestly. He built a nap directly into the middle of the working day, a scheduled rest, before the office of nun specifically to make up the difference, ensuring his monks still received their full quota of sleep across the full 24 hours, just rearranged into pieces rather than delivered in one unbroken block. Doesn't that arrangement sound oddly familiar given what we already talked about tonight? Ordinary households outside those monastery walls were falling into a first sleep and a second sleep, separated by a natural, unscheduled waking hour that belonged to nobody in particular. Monks inside the walls were doing something that looked almost identical from the outside sleep, interrupted by a wakeful period in the middle of the night, followed by more sleep plus a scheduled nap to balance the books. The shape was nearly the same. The reason behind it could not have been more different. One pattern grew naturally out of a body responding to darkness and firelight. The other was a deliberate engineered interruption imposed on top of the body whether it wanted it or not, in service of a promise made to God rather than a rhythm the body invented for itself. And this was not simply my own speculation connecting the two. Records from the period describe ordinary lay people with no monastic vows at all, treating a single midnight waking and a short prayer as its own small act of virtue borrowed directly from the example set behind monastery walls before climbing back into bed for the remainder of the night. Here is where the story gets a little uncanny, actually, because this is not purely a medieval curiosity confined to old manuscripts. Cloistered monks and nuns still keep this exact schedule today in monasteries scattered around the world, waking for matins in the middle of the night the same way their predecessors did 1,000 years ago. Sleep researchers eventually took notice and studied a small group of these modern monks and nuns directly tracking their body temperature and sleep patterns around the clock. What they found was remarkable. The monks' and nuns' bodies had truly adapted to the ancient schedule, their internal temperature rhythms actually beginning to rise in anticipation of the midnight prayer before an alarm ever sounded, as though 1,000 years of practice had quietly rewired something at the biological level. The researchers also noted something a little more bittersweet, though. Compared to people sleeping a single unbroken night, these modern monks and nuns reported more trouble falling back asleep after matins somewhat shorter, total sleep overall, and more frequent vivid dreamlike experiences right at the edge of sleep, occasionally even dreaming in conversation, and sometimes fittingly dreaming in prayer. I find myself wondering honestly whether monastic life simply borrowed the natural shape of medieval sleep and gave it a stricter purpose, or whether centuries of monasteries quietly practicing broken sleep helped normalize the very pattern ordinary households were already falling into anyway. I do not think anyone can answer that with real certainty. But it is a truly interesting question to fall asleep turning over in your own mind tonight. Have you ever set an alarm for the middle of the night for a flight, a delivery, a video call in a different time zone, and felt that particular disoriented, slightly resentful fog the rest of the next day? Now imagine setting that alarm every single night for your entire life by choice, as an act of devotion in a stone room with no heating, memorizing scripture by heart because there was nothing bright enough to see it by. There is a certain modern irony worth noticing here too if you spend any time online. Waking up absurdly early, cutting sleep short on purpose, structuring your entire day around rigid, unforgiving blocks of discipline has quietly become a whole productivity trend in its own right. 5 o'clock clubs, cold showers before dawn, people proudly calling their own focused isolation monk mode without necessarily knowing where that word actually came from. I find that a little funny, honestly. We keep rediscovering and rebranding a lifestyle that actual monks were already living considerably more strictly well over 1,000 years before anyone thought to put it in a self-improvement video. It would be easy to imagine monastic life as peaceful, orderly, undisturbed, a gentle rhythm of bells and quiet contemplation, far removed from the noisy, crowded sleeping arrangements we've spent most of tonight exploring. I would push back on that image a little. In terms of pure, repeated sleep disruption night after night, decade after decade, a Benedictine monk arguably lived one of the most sleep-interrupted lifestyles medieval Europe had to offer, more disciplined about it than almost anyone outside the walls, and far less able to simply skip a night when exhaustion caught up with him. Some later orders pushed the discipline even further still. Cluniac houses expanded the daily round of prayer well beyond Benedict's original 8 hours, adding extra psalms and extra offices, until the monks of Cluny were sometimes said to spend more waking hours singing in choir than doing almost anything else, including sleeping. Carthusian monks, uniquely among most orders, were given their own individual cells specifically, so each man could keep his nightly vigil in near total solitude, awake in the dark alone by choice, night after night for the rest of his life. without even the small comfort of a fellow monk's presence nearby to share the exhaustion with. None of this discipline, this careful stacking of prayer onto every corner of the day, and a fair portion of the night too, actually began with Benedict, or even with Christianity itself, central as it became to it. The habit of splitting up rest-marking time with deliberate purpose, watching through part of the night rather than surrendering to all of it, reaches back considerably further than any monastery wall, all the way to an empire that had already been dividing its own nights long before a single church bell ever rang across Europe. Rome's most famous sleeping habit had nothing to do with night at all. It happened in broad daylight in the middle of the day in plain view of the entire city, and an empire of millions of people built its daily schedule around it, without a hint of embarrassment. We have spent most of tonight talking about the dark curfews and candlelight demons and monastery bells, all of it shaped by the simple problem of how to survive the hours after sunset. Rome's contribution to this story flips that whole premise on its head. The Romans were not primarily worried about surviving the night. In large parts of their empire, surviving the middle of the day was the harder problem. Here is a small piece of etymology that might truly surprise you, especially if you have ever used the word yourself without a second thought. Siesta. That word did not begin in Spain, whatever the postcards and travel guides might imply. It began as a Roman description of the clock. The Romans divided daylight into 12 hours counted from sunrise to sunset, which meant the length of an hour actually stretched and shrank, with the seasons longer in summer, shorter in winter, a detail that would drive most of us today slightly insane. A Roman hour in June and a Roman hour in December were not remotely the same length, and nobody seemed particularly bothered by that inconvenience since the whole system was built around the sun's own schedule rather than a mechanical device that needed everything to line up neatly. The 6th of those 12 hours landed squarely at midday, and the Romans called it quite simply hora sexta, the 6th hour. Centuries later, as Latin slowly reshaped itself into Spanish on the Iberian Peninsula, hora sexta gradually wore down into a single word, siesta. Every single time somebody uses that word today, ordering an afternoon nap in Madrid, or joking about needing one after a heavy lunch, they are technically still counting Roman hours without realizing it. Isn't it strange how a civilization can vanish completely and still leave behind something as small and stubborn as a clock reading quietly baked into a language nobody in Rome ever spoke? So why did midday specifically earn its own dedicated pause in the first place? The honest answer is considerably less romantic than the word suggests. It was heat, plain and simple. Across large stretches of the Mediterranean world, working through the hours immediately surrounding noon when the sun sat almost directly overhead, was not just unpleasant, it was truly dangerous, especially for anyone labouring outdoors in a field, a quarry or a construction site. Pausing during those hours, resting in whatever shade could be found, and picking work back up once the worst of the heat had passed was not laziness. It was basic self-preservation, the same instinct that makes you avoid standing directly in full sun at the hottest point of a summer afternoon today, except the Romans built an entire social rhythm around honouring that instinct rather than fighting through it with sunscreen and air conditioning. Remember too that the empire practicing this was not one small city with one climate. Rome's territory eventually stretched from the misty hills of northern Britain to the scorching edges of the Sahara from Spain in the west to the deserts bordering Persia in the east. The midday pause mattered enormously in Iberia and North Africa, across the sun-scorched provinces of the eastern Mediterranean, considerably less in the cooler, cloudier stretches of Roman Gaul or Britain, where a Roman soldier stationed near Hadrian's Wall likely felt very little urgency to escape a midday sun that barely bothered showing up at all. Have you ever noticed how a single company spread across different countries today still ends up running on slightly different unofficial rhythms depending on the local climate and culture, even under one shared set of official policies. Rome, it turns out, was already managing exactly that same problem 2,000 years ago, one sun-drenched province at a time. Let me introduce you to one particular Roman who took this practice and, in typical fashion for the man, turned it into something almost aggressively disciplined. Gaius Plinius Secundus, known to history as Pliny the Elder, was a naval commander, a natural historian, and by every surviving account one of the most relentlessly hard-working men the Roman world ever produced. We know an enormous amount about his daily schedule because his nephew Pliny the Younger wrote it all down in a letter that has survived intact for almost 2,000 years, one of those small historical miracles where a private family memory somehow outlives entire empires. According to that letter, the elder Pliny began studying before dawn, visited the emperor on official business, while it was still dark outside, returned home to keep working through his official duties, and even had someone recite from a book to him during meals, so he would not lose a single spare minute to idle conversation. He kept assistants nearby specifically to recite to him while he bathed, while he sat in the sun, while he ate, extracting notes from every single page, because he apparently believed there was no book so poorly written that it did not contain at least one worthwhile passage. This was not by any measure a man inclined to waste time. And then, in the middle of this almost frantic devotion to productivity, his nephew records something that might surprise you. After his light midday meal, taken simply in the old-fashioned style his family valued, Pliny the Elder took a short nap. Even Rome's most famous workaholic, a man who scheduled reading time into his own bathing routine, still respected the midday pause. He did not treat it as wasted time. He treated it as scheduled maintenance, exactly the kind of brief, deliberate reset a body needs before pushing through another several hours of demanding work. Pliny the Elder died in the eruption of Vesuvius in the year 79, sailing directly toward the disaster to help rescue trapped friends rather than fleeing to safety himself, which tells you something about the kind of relentless, almost stubborn dedication that also apparently made room every single day for a nap. Have you ever felt slightly guilty for needing a break in the middle of an especially busy day, as though rest were something you had to earn rather than something your body simply requires? I think about Pliny the Elder sometimes when that feeling creeps in. If one of history's most driven workaholics still made time for it, the rest of us are probably allowed to as well. Of course not everyone experienced the midday pause the same way, and I do not want to leave you with the impression that meridiatio, as the Romans called this rest period, looked identical across every level of Roman society. For a wealthy man like Pliny, the pause was cultivated almost intellectual, a chance to study, to think, to recover before returning to scholarship, taken in a shaded courtyard with a slave standing by to fan the air or fetch cool water the moment it was needed. For the enslaved people who made Roman households like his run in the first place, and for the labourers working fields and quarries, under that same brutal midday sun, the pause was not a luxury of choice at all. It was simple physical necessity survival, rather than self-improvement, the difference between finishing the day's work and collapsing from heat before it was done. Nobody handed a field worker in southern Italy a book to have someone recite while he rested. He simply found what shade existed, drank what water he had, and waited for the worst of the heat to pass before picking the work back up exactly where he left it. The empire wrapped one single shared practice around two entirely different realities, depending entirely on which side of it you happen to be standing on. The habit did not stay confined to elite households and private letters either. It worked its way into the actual civic rhythm of Roman cities. Markets, courts, and public business generally quieted during the hottest stretch of the afternoon, an unofficial but widely honoured pause built directly into how an entire city, expected its day to unfold shutters coming down over shop fronts, court proceedings, pausing mid-argument, the usual roar of a Roman street settling into something closer to a hush. This was not a handful of tired individuals sneaking away for private naps. It was closer to an entire civilization collectively agreeing that the sun at its peak simply was not worth arguing with, and the habit outlived Rome itself by a spectacular margin. A letter from the 5th century written by a Roman aristocrat named Sidonius Apollinaris casually mentions his own after-dinner nap proof that the custom was still alive and unremarkable centuries after the practice first took hold, long after the empire that invented the word for it had already begun crumbling around its edges. The tradition rooted itself especially deeply on the Iberian Peninsula, where Roman rule had left behind not just roads and aqueducts, but this exact rhythm of the day. By the time Spanish literature was flourishing more than 1,000 years later, the custom was so thoroughly embedded in daily life that the writer Miguel de Cervantes could have his beloved character Sancho Panza casually retreat for a lengthy afternoon sleep after a big meal without needing to explain the habit to a single reader, the way a modern novelist might mention a character grabbing a coffee without stopping to explain what coffee is. Even today, the tradition has not entirely vanished, whatever air conditioning and 9-to-5 office culture might suggest. Recent surveys suggest something like 1 in 6 people in Spain still takes a proper siesta 4 or more times a week, holding on to a rhythm that technically began as a Roman description of a clock reading more than 2,000 years ago on the far side of the Mediterranean. Researchers studying the habit have even found some evidence that regular napping may carry real health benefits, fewer cardiovascular problems among people who nap regularly, compared to those who push straight through the afternoon, though nobody in ancient Rome needed a modern study to justify what their own bodies were already telling them. Here's a thought worth sitting with tonight, especially if it happens to be sitting somewhere past 2 in the afternoon wherever you actually are. Most of us still feel some version of that same midday dip. The Romans built their entire schedule around that heavy, foggy stretch after lunch, when concentration quietly evaporates no matter how much sleep we got the night before. We simply handle it differently now. Instead of resting through it the way an entire empire once did, most modern workplaces expect us to push straight through with a cup of coffee, and sheer stubbornness treating the dip itself as a personal failing, rather than a completely normal, thoroughly documented rhythm built directly into human biology. I'm not entirely convinced we made the better trade. It would be easy to hear the word siesta today and picture nothing more than a stereotype hammock sombreros, an excuse for an afternoon off the punchline in a joke about countries that supposedly do not take work seriously. I would gently push back on that image too, the same way I have pushed back on a few other tired assumptions tonight. What began in Rome was never really about laziness at all. It was a civilization paying careful practical attention to its own climate and its own biology, then building an entire daily rhythm smart enough to work with both instead of fighting them. If anything, the stereotype has the whole story backward. Ignoring your own body's obvious signals in favor of relentless, uninterrupted output is the newer, stranger idea here. Stopping deliberately in the middle of the day is the one with 2,000 years of precedent behind it. The rhythm shaped more than just work schedules too. Once the heat of midday had passed and the pause had done its job, Roman social life tended to shift toward the bathhouse, the great public thermae that anchored daily life in almost every city of any size. Afternoons, rather than mornings, became the natural hour for soaking socializing, catching up on gossip, and business alike in a shared pool of heated water, a habit that only really made sense once you understand it as the second half of a day already reorganized around the sun. work in the cooler morning, rest through the punishing midday heat, socialize and unwind once the worst of it had passed. It was less a single habit than an entire architecture for living inside a Mediterranean climate, one piece supporting the next. Rome's heat shaped how an empire slept in the middle of the day. But cross an ocean and jump forward more than 1,000 years, and you find an entirely different climate, forcing an entirely different set of sleeping arrangements onto young couples who were, for reasons that had nothing to do with the sun at all, trying to stay warm. Picture this scene, and I promise I'm not making it up. A young man arrives at a farmhouse deep in a New England winter snow piled against the door, breath fogging in the last light of a freezing afternoon, invited inside by a girl's own parents, fed supper by the fire, and then with those same parents' full blessing shown upstairs to climb into bed right alongside their unmarried daughter for the night, fully clothed, under careful supervision, and quite often with a large wooden board wedged firmly down the middle of the mattress, separating the two of them just in case anyone's good intentions happened to wander. This custom had a name, and it was delightfully simply bundling. If your first instinct is to assume this must have happened somewhere loose, somewhere scandalous, somewhere far removed from strict religious values, I want you to sit with the actual location for a second. This was Puritan New England, a society we usually picture as buttoned up to the throat, obsessed with sin, one bad decision away from a scarlet letter stitched onto your chest. And yet for well over a century, respectable families in exactly that society were tucking their unmarried daughters into bed alongside courting young men on purpose, with parental approval as a completely normal part of getting to know a future spouse. So what on earth was actually going on here? The honest, unglamorous answer starts with something we've already spent a fair amount of tonight discussing from a very different angle. Heat, or rather the desperate lack of it. Colonial New England winters were brutal, houses were drafty, firewood was expensive, and required real labour to cut, haul, and split, and keeping an entire farmhouse warm through a long evening simply was not always possible. Most homes had exactly one room worth heating properly after dark, and that room was usually already occupied by the rest of the family settling in for their own night. If a young man had travelled a considerable distance, sometimes several hours on foot, or horseback across truly dangerous winter roads, to spend an evening courting a young woman he hoped to marry, sending him back out into the freezing dark at 9 o'clock made very little practical sense to anyone involved. Better the thinking went to let the courting couple keep talking, keep getting to know each other, tucked together under the one set of warm blankets the household actually had to spare rather than waste fuel, keeping an entire separate room heated for a conversation that could just as easily continue under a quilt. Would you have trusted that arrangement if you were the parent standing at the bottom of those stairs? It is worth remembering that this was never a couple sneaking off unsupervised. The girl's parents were typically asleep or pretending to be in the very next room near enough to hear practically anything. The privacy on offer was really just the privacy of darkness and a closed door, not genuine isolation. And unlike a modern couple disappearing off to a private apartment with nobody else around at all, everyone involved understood the arrangement's exact deliberate limits, agreed upon in advance by everyone under that particular roof. The custom itself likely did not originate in the colonies at all. Historians trace similar practices back across the ocean to Wales, where it carried the rather lovely name Caru Yinigweli, literally loving in the bed, and to Dutch courting traditions that used a different word entirely, but followed a remarkably similar logic. European settlers carried the habit with them across the Atlantic, and it took root particularly deeply in rural New England, where cold winters and scattered farmhouses made the original practical reasoning even more urgent than it had been back home. Farms in New England were not clustered tightly together the way villages often were in the old country either. A suitor might truly have no reasonable way home once darkness fell, not because he was being dramatic about the cold, but because the nearest safe road home simply was not passable or findable after dark. Here is where it gets truly interesting though, because bundling was never simply tolerated in silence. People argued about it loudly in print from actual pulpits, and two of the loudest voices happened to speak up in the very same year, taking completely opposite positions. In 1781, a Connecticut minister named Samuel Peters sat down and defended the custom in his own written history of the colony, insisting the practice had continued for roughly a century and a half among people of what he called sober and virtuous principles, and delivering one of the more quotable lines to survive from the whole debate. Bundling, he argued, produced considerably more genuine chastity than what he considered its supposedly more refined replacement courting couples sitting alone together on a sofa. Peters, it is worth mentioning, had 3 daughters of his own, and was by his own account speaking from decades of direct parental experience rather than theory. A popular folk verse circulating around the same period made a similar case in miniature, insisting that so long as coats and undergarments and breeches were all removed before anyone climbed in, an honest young man and a virtuous young woman could lie together all night without a single thing going wrong. Whether every household actually lived up to that tidy little rhyme is of course an entirely separate question. That very same year in Dedham, Massachusetts, a different minister named Jason Haven stood up in front of his own congregation and did the exact opposite, condemning bundling from the pulpit as a dangerous route of exactly the kind of temptation Peters insisted it prevented, reportedly specific enough in his sermon that certain members of his own congregation must have squirmed uncomfortably in their pews, wondering just how much detail their minister actually knew about their own courting habits. Isn't that wonderful in its own strange way? 2 respected clergymen the same year, the same general region, looking at the exact same custom and arriving at completely opposite conclusions about whether it protected virtue or destroyed it. If you have ever felt like every generation argues endlessly about the supposedly declining morals of young people, take some comfort in knowing colonial New England was having that exact argument too, just with wooden boards and quilted blankets standing in for whatever debate feels urgent today. We even have a first-hand account from someone who experienced the custom directly, rather than simply arguing about it from a safe distance. A British Army officer named Thomas Ambry, stationed in Massachusetts during the Revolutionary War, wrote home describing an evening spent at a farmhouse where he was invited to bundle with a young woman he named simply as Jemima, under her own parents' roof, entirely in keeping with local custom. You can almost picture the scene from his letter, a foreign officer already slightly bewildered by colonial life sitting by the fire, while his host casually explained a courting tradition that would have raised every eyebrow back home in England. Ambry describes the invitation matter-of-factly, clearly aware of the temptation such an arrangement presented, and by his own account chose to hold back rather than fully embrace what local tradition would have permitted. Whatever you make of his restraint, his letter gives us something rare, an actual outsider's eyewitness account of the custom in practice, rather than a moralizing sermon written at a safe distance from any actual bed. Have you ever been handed a tradition by someone else's family, a custom that felt completely normal to them and slightly bewildering to you, and had to decide on the spot how seriously to take it? I imagine that is roughly the position poor Ambry found himself in, politely caught between foreign hospitality and his own better judgment. Now, I would be doing you a disservice if I painted bundling as some flawless system with a perfect record. Contemporary critics, including a sceptical English clergyman named Andrew Burnaby, noted rather dryly that if a young woman did happen to become pregnant, as a result of an evening's bundling, the young man in question was generally expected under real social and religious pressure to marry her without delay. The wooden board and the layers of clothing were a deterrent strongly encouraged and broadly respected, but never a guarantee, and colonial church records occasionally confirm exactly the outcome the system was designed to prevent. Historians who have gone digging through old parish registers have found exactly the pattern you might expect: a noticeable rise in babies arriving suspiciously soon after a wedding in communities where bundling was common practice. The system worked, in other words, roughly as well as any system built entirely on trust good manners, and a single plank of wood tends to work, which is to say most of the time with a few memorable exceptions. By the middle of the 1700s, fashionable opinion in cities like Boston, Salem, and Newport had started to turn firmly against the whole practice. Wealthier, more urban families increasingly considered bundling old-fashioned, even faintly embarrassing, and introduced a new, supposedly more genteel alternative for courting couples. Instead, the sofa positioned respectably in a parlour in full view of anyone who happened to walk past. It is worth pausing on how strange that reversal actually is. A piece of furniture sat upright, fully in the open, replaced a shared bed as the more respectable choice purely because it looked more proper, even though the bed had at least come wrapped in boards, blankets, layers of clothing, and a sleeping set of parents just through the wall. Samuel Peters, writing decades later in 81, was essentially arguing a losing battle by that point, defending a tradition that fashionable society had already started quietly abandoning in favour of upholstered furniture and better heated parlours. Rural communities held on considerably longer than the cities did, since the actual economic reasons behind bundling expensive fuel and long-travelled distances had not gone anywhere, just because Boston decided the custom looked unrefined. The practice spread well beyond New England too, following settlers south into New York and Pennsylvania, and eventually out toward the frontier communities of the expanding Midwest, wherever cold winters and scattered isolated farms made the same original logic hold true. Some Amish and Mennonite communities whose entire way of life prizes practical simplicity over changing fashion reportedly held onto versions of the custom long after fashionable city dwellers had moved on to their parlours and their sofas, a reminder that a truly useful solution to a real problem rarely disappears just because polite society decides to be embarrassed by it. So maybe that is the real lesson tucked inside this particular custom, more than any specific board or blanket. We tend to imagine strict religious societies as uniformly repressed, every impulse locked down tight behind stern morality. Colonial New England was considerably more practical and honestly more interesting than that flattened stereotype allows. Faced with brutal winters, expensive fuel, and young people who needed real unsupervised feeling time to decide whether they actually wanted to marry each other, an entire religious culture built a supervised, socially sanctioned workaround, argued about its morality constantly and publicly, and mostly trusted it to work more often than it failed. Have you noticed, by the way, how often that exact same pattern has repeated itself tonight across every single culture we have visited? A real practical problem shows up first: cold darkness, hunger, fear, scarcity. A workaround gets built to solve it, and only afterward does an entire structure of manners, morality, folklore, and argument grow up around that workaround, until it starts to feel less like a practical solution and more like a tradition worth defending or condemning on principle alone. Bundling was never really about romance any more than curtains around a bed were really about fashion, or a curfew bell was really about obedience. It was about cold and a household trying to solve a real problem with the materials and the trust it actually had on hand. We have spent this entire night walking through bedrooms scattered across roughly 2,000 years of human history, curfew bells and Roman heat servants on trundle beds, and strangers sharing an inn, monks interrupting their own sleep on purpose, and ordinary families interrupting theirs without even trying to, each culture solving the exact same handful of nightly problems in its own particular way, shaped by whatever climate, faith, class, or fear happened to be pressing hardest on that particular place and time. And now, having travelled from a village outside London all the way to a snowbound farmhouse in colonial Massachusetts, it feels like exactly the right moment to step back, take a breath, and ask what all of these strange, careful, deeply human arrangements were actually trying to tell us all along about the simple act of closing our eyes at the end of the day. I think the answer has been sitting quietly underneath every single story tonight, waiting for us to notice it. Think back for a moment to where we actually started. A 9-year-old girl sitting in a cold English courtroom more than 3 centuries ago, mentioning almost in passing that her mother had woken from a first sleep and simply never come back inside. That one small, sad detail cracked open an entire forgotten rhythm of the human night, a rhythm most of us had completely lost without ever noticing it was gone. From there, a bell rang out over a wooden town, not to frighten anyone but to protect it. One covered fire at a time, a bell that in at least one small English town is somehow still ringing tonight, whether anyone actually needs its warning or not. A myth about tiny beds and bolt-upright sleepers turned out to be mostly untrue, and the real explanation hiding underneath the myth was more interesting than the legend ever was. A dying playwright left his wife a bed, and 400 years of readers mistook an act of love for an insult, simply because nobody bothered to check the second sentence before reacting to the first. A servant slept a few feet from the people he protected. A family pressed near together for warmth on a mattress stuffed with straw, sharing the room more often than not with fleas neither side could really do anything about. A curtain drawn shut around a bed did the quiet work of a wall nobody could afford to build. A stranger, a total stranger, lay down beside another stranger at a crowded inn, and somehow, night after night for centuries, that arrangement mostly just worked right down to 2 future founding fathers of a young nation arguing amiably in the dark over whether or not to leave a window open. A word that once meant demon slowly softened over hundreds of years into simply meaning a bad dream. While somewhere behind a monastery wall a small group of men kept interrupting their own sleep, on purpose, convinced that a promise made to God was worth more than an unbroken night's rest. An empire built an entire afternoon around escaping the sun, and left the word for it hiding inside a language it never even spoke. And 2 young people, half a world and 1,000 years away from all of that, climbed into one bed, fully clothed, a wooden board between them, simply trying to survive a New England winter without freezing, or more importantly to everyone involved, without disappointing their parents. Very different centuries, very different countries. Almost none of these people ever heard of each other. And yet laid out side by side like this, I hope you can see what I saw while I was putting this whole story together for you. Notice too how many of these stories quietly belong to women once you actually go looking for them. A frightened girl testifying in court. A wife whose second best bed turned out to hold an entire marriage inside it. Mothers nursing infants during a wakeful hour nobody thought to write down properly. Ladies in waiting choosing to sleep on the floor of a queen's own chamber rather than somewhere safer but lonelier. Daughters carrying a mother's feather bed into a brand new household as the largest gift they had to offer. History does not always bother to record these smaller, quieter details as carefully as it records kings and wars and treaties, but they were there the entire time, holding just as much of the actual weight of the past as anything with a crown attached to it. None of it was really about sleep at all. It was about fear and love and money and faith and the particular kind of stubborn practicality human beings reach for whenever a real problem refuses to solve itself politely. A bell rang because fire could kill you. A board sat down the middle of a mattress because a family's reputation mattered as much as anyone's warmth. A hagstone hung over a bed because the dark has always felt a little less safe when you're lying flat alone, unable to move, waiting for morning. Every single custom we walk through tonight, strange as it looked from a distance, was really just an ordinary answer to an ordinary human worry dressed up in whatever fashion fabric or folklore happened to be available in that particular century. Here is the part I keep coming back to, though the part that actually changed how I think about my own bed a little while researching all of this. We tend to hear about these old customs and feel a small, comfortable flicker of superiority. Sleeping sitting up because of short beds. Waking twice a night like it was some kind of malfunction. Boards between courting couples. Bells and prayers and hagstones standing guard against demons. It is very easy to feel modern and clever and safely past all of that, but I am not sure we have actually solved anything. We have just changed the costume. If there is one quiet thread running underneath almost everything I brought you tonight, it is this. Nearly every strange old custom we uncovered had a perfectly sound piece of logic sitting right underneath it, once you actually took the time to look. The short bed was mostly a myth. The insult in Shakespeare's will was mostly a misunderstanding. The bundling board was less about romance and more about arithmetic, fuel and distance. History rarely hands us pure foolishness, no matter how foolish the surface details might look from 4 or 5 centuries away. It usually hands us people working with the tools, the fears and the knowledge available to them at the time, doing their genuine best with all three. I think that is worth remembering the next time something from the past strikes you as simply, obviously silly. There is very often a second sentence worth reading before you decide. We still wake up at 3 in the morning and assume something is wrong with us the same way people did 600 years ago, except we now call it insomnia instead of simply the space between 2 sleeps. We still crave a locked door, a familiar presence nearby, something between us and the dark. We have just traded a trundle bed and a servant for a security camera and a phone within arm's reach. We still divide our own day around exhaustion, the way an entire Roman Empire once did. We simply call it a coffee break instead of a siesta, and feel slightly guilty about needing it at all. We still feel that same instinctive, slightly embarrassed need for a story, a voice, something gentle standing between us and our own thoughts right before we drift off, which, now that I say it out loud, might be the entire reason you are still here listening to me instead of scrolling through something louder. Isn't that a strange thing to realize this late into a very long story? The exact impulse that made a frightened person in the 1500s hang a stone with a hole in it over their bed is the same impulse currently keeping you here, letting a calm voice fill the quiet instead of facing it alone. Different tools, same tired, hopeful, endlessly human request. Please just help me get through the night. I do not think that is something to feel embarrassed about, by the way, in case any part of you was starting to. I think it might be one of the more beautiful threads running underneath everything we covered tonight. Across every single century we visited in every single country, under every kind of roof, rich or poor, married or courting, guarded by a servant or a stranger, or absolutely nobody at all. People kept doing the same small tender thing for each other. They made the night a little less frightening for the person lying beside them, a parent staying near, a bell warning the whole street, an innkeeper pairing bedfellows with real care, a charm whispered meant for someone else's comfort as much as your own. Even Shakespeare, it turns out, may have simply been trying to leave his wife the one object in the house that had actually held them both. We spend so much energy across so many centuries simply trying to make sure the people we love are not facing the dark by themselves. That has not changed even slightly, no matter what year it happens to be. I think that is really why stories like this one are worth telling at all, if I am honest with you. Not simply to collect strange facts, interesting as they are, but because looking closely at how people once handled their own fear, their own cold nights, their own uncertainty, quietly gives us permission to handle ours a little more gently too. History is not only a record of what happened. Sometimes it is a very old, very patient friend reminding you that whatever is keeping you awake tonight has almost certainly kept someone else awake before in some other century, under some other roof, and that they made it through until morning anyway, and so in all likelihood will you. So here is what I actually want you to take with you more than any single fact about bellsboards or bedbugs as you drift off tonight. If you wake up in an hour or 2 or 3 and find yourself lying there in the quiet wide awake for no obvious reason, I need you to know that you are not broken. You're not failing at sleep. You're in a strange and rather lovely way simply keeping a very old appointment, one that people have been quietly keeping for as long as there have been nights at all. Somewhere long before electric light rewired the whole idea of what a night is even supposed to look like, someone exactly like you was lying awake in that exact same stretch of darkness, listening to their own house settle, thinking their own private thoughts, waiting patiently for sleep to come find them again. Maybe they got up to check the fire the way an entire street once did the moment a bell told them to. Maybe they simply lay there, hands folded, listening to a familiar breathing sound somewhere nearby and let that be enough. You're allowed to simply rest there for a while, doing exactly the same thing. Nothing is wrong. You're only doing what nearly every single person before you has quietly done as well, stretching back further than any calendar most of us could name. And if sleep does come easily and completely tonight, straight through until morning, no waking hour, no wondering, that is more than fine too. Body's not required to follow history's exact rhythm, just because we spent a few hours tonight admiring it together. Either way, awake for a while or asleep within minutes, you're exactly where you're supposed to be. I want to say a genuine thank you before I let you go for tonight. Thank you for staying with me this long through curfew bells and canopy beds, through Roman heat and colonial winters, through every strange, small human detail I could find and bring back to you. Stories like this take a great deal of care to put together properly, hours spent chasing down old letters and forgotten court records and half-remembered legends just to hand you something worth falling asleep to. The only reason any of that effort is worth it at all is because people like you are still willing to lie back, dim the lights, and actually listen. That means more to me than any number ever could, and it is not something I take for granted, not even once. If you enjoyed travelling through tonight's particular corner of history with me, I would love to have you back for the next one. There is always another forgotten room somewhere in the past, another strange rule that turns out to make perfect sense once you understand it, another quiet story waiting to be pulled carefully out of the dark and handed to you right before sleep. I already have a few in mind that I cannot wait to share with you. I will be here whenever you are ready for them. Until then, take good care of yourself in whatever small, ordinary way your own century happens to offer you a warm blanket, a locked door, a voice you trust, filling the quiet. It is, as it turns out, exactly what people have always needed. For now, though, let the story go. Let your thoughts get slower and heavier, and a little less organized the way they are supposed to at this hour. Whatever century you happen to be falling asleep in tonight, you are in good company. Good night.